The end had arrived. Evan apologized for his weakness, wishing Chris had been the hero instead. The mage countered, asking him not to say that, insisting they did their best. She wondered if Chris mastering swordsmanship earlier could have changed things, perhaps making him a 10-star hero strong enough to avert this. This Chris, the great extra, had a talent for instant mastery. His journey started 20 years ago, escaping his clan and working in back alleys, a time he recalled vividly. The Demon King's invasion, the Cage of Destruction, began, filling the skies with monstrous riders. People gathered fearfully around notice boards, where Chris saw a recruitment call to join the hero's party. He saw it as his big chance, dreaming of future wealth and glory after the war. But they failed, and the world fell to the Demon King. Chris wished time could be turned back so the other Chris could be the hero, but instantly rejected reliving the suffering. One life of that was enough. Daydreaming was pointless as the world ended. This was it. His last thought was a wish for a simple, rich next life, if such a thing existed. And that was his parting thought. He felt something. He had regressed, reborn as a young master in the magic empire, specifically within the dark magic clan's imposing fortress, one of the 12 supporting clans. He figured he was 15 years in the past, 5 years before the Cage of Destruction. He wryly noted even demons apparently enjoyed gardening, a new experience for him. More importantly, he recognized his new body's identity, Christian Van Baron Kazar. He remembered Evan identifying Christian by his noble name, confirming he was from a branch family. The House of Kazar, though a branch of the Baron County, held significant standing and were incredibly rich, known throughout the empire. Chris recalled hearing of 2 successors, with Christian being the infamous, troublemaking eldest son, always causing problems until even his father gave up. Evan had called it old news. When Chris asked if he'd changed, Evan revealed Christian was murdered by relatives. Chris felt immense frustration. Why this specific body, this place, this loser destined for death? He stared at his reflection, needing a plan. He'd been in this body for 3 days. Christian was fated to die in 2 years. His elimination by an honor-bound family meant he was likely useless. Maybe staying quiet could save him, letting him enjoy the inherited wealth? No chance. Ragnarok was coming. The Demon King started the war to fuel it with human sacrifices. Both empires fell because they realized too late. To survive, Chris had to stop the apocalypse. The Demon King was one problem, his loyal fiends another. He needed to become more powerful than the Demon King. There was only one way: become the Demon Emperor. With 5 years before the end, he decided to go for it. If he won, the whole empire would be his. Christian, a man, Count Kazar, angrily interrupted, demanding why he wasn't in his room, questioning his shamelessness after the last incident. The Count threatened decapitation for future missteps. His aura was intense. Chris knew he needed to fix Christian's image. Kneeling, he apologized to his father for past wrongs. The Count was stunned. Chris reiterated his sincere regret, promising change. The Count was skeptical, accusing him of mockery after his recent stunt. Chris couldn't recall which specific mess it was. There were too many candidates. Chris blamed his own past actions for the distrust, but cited his reported memory loss from 3 days ago. He claimed reflecting on his past revealed his errors, his heart confirming this truth. The Count dismissed it as another excuse. Chris agreed words were cheap and would show his change through actions, requesting to be sent to the punishment cave for a month to prove himself. The punishment cave was a foreboding structure nestled in shadow, a prison designed for high-status fiends where darkness reigned and all 5 senses were blocked. Such profound sensory deprivation could shatter a mind within days. Yet for Chris, it was precisely what he needed, a sanctuary from prying eyes. Back in the Count's office, his father expressed severe disbelief, doubting Christian could endure the cave for even half a day. Chris acknowledged the cave's infamous difficulty, but insisted this ordeal was the bare minimum necessary to begin earning his father's trust. The Count reminded him of their numerous past conversations, each ending in Christian's further disappointment, often punctuated by drunken stupors. Despite the history of letdowns, the Count relented, deciding to play along and grant this one last chance. However, he issued a stern ultimatum. If, after a month, Christian showed no genuine change, he would be banished from the clan. Chris's fist clenched subtly. Banishment was tantamount to a death sentence. Stripped of the Khazar name and protection, Christian would be easy prey for the long list of enemies he had accrued. Still, Chris calmly accepted the terms. He then added his own condition. Should he succeed in proving his transformation, his father must grant him a request. The Count scoffed at the perceived arrogance, finding it laughable Christian expected to emerge unscathed, let alone changed. Nevertheless, he agreed, reiterating his profound doubt that such a thing would ever happen before turning and leaving the room. Alone now, Chris waited. Soon, Cox, the gaunt, half-vampire butler of the house, entered, informing the young master that the punishment cave was prepared. Chris acknowledged him curtly, dropping a coin onto a nearby table as if dismissing the butler. He then proceeded down the grand, sunlit hallway. As he walked, whispers followed him like shadows. Servants murmured about the good-for-nothing volunteering for the cave, questioning his motives and speculating on his latest scheme. They recalled his recent transgression, insulting the young lady of the rival poison magic clan, an incident so severe the Count himself had to offer a personal apology, symbolically represented by a torn official document. Chris overheard their gossip, internally noting the shame Christian had brought upon the family name. The servants continued, sighing over the young master's seemingly perpetual immaturity and betting on how long he'd actually last inside the cave. One guessed 2 days, tops, an opinion shared by a figure observing from the sidelines. Cox led Chris to the cave's entrance, a massive, ornate doorway pulsing with faint energy, flanked by 2 imposing, armored figures. These were Death Knights, their blue aura radiating cold power. Chris found the use of such undead guards quite fitting for the Magic Empire's aesthetic, albeit unsettling. As he approached, a voice called out, addressing him as Big Brother. Chris paused, turning with a questioning look. He recognized the face instantly. Thurn van Barenkazar, Christian's biological younger brother, known for being a model student, the polar opposite of Christian. Suddenly, Thurn drew his slender rapier, its tip aimed directly at Chris, the tension palpable between them. Startled internally but maintaining a calm exterior, Chris inquired about Thurn's business, remarking dryly that he didn't seem like he was there for a heartfelt farewell. Thurn didn't mince words, stating he was sure Christian knew he was a disgrace to the family. His eyes narrowed, warning Chris with cold fury that if he dared to sully their family's honor again, Thurn would kill him personally. Ah, Chris thought, so must be him. Thurn was the relative who killed Christian in the original timeline. Chris recalled encountering Thurn during the Age of Destruction. Back then, the younger brother had been a formidable user of curse magic. Seeing him now, Chris mused Thurn had been somewhat cute as a child and had clearly trained diligently. But compared to the horrors Chris had witnessed, Thurn was just a brat. Dismissively, Chris told him to move it. Thurn reacted with disbelief, but Chris simply repeated his command to get going. He turned his back on the fuming younger brother and walked towards the cave entrance, leaving Thurn standing there, stunned and ignored by Cox and the Death Knights. Thurn glared after him, utterly bewildered by Chris's uncharacteristic attitude. Chris stepped across the threshold, plunging into absolute darkness. He could neither see nor hear. The only external input was the barest tactile sensation remaining around his fingertips, likely a deliberate feature, he surmised, perhaps to allow food delivery or simply prevent complete sensory death, a condition that would mentally drain any ordinary person rapidly. For Chris, however, this was irrelevant. He'd faced far worse isolation during his treasure-hunting days, and this sensory blockade was actually advantageous. It would allow him to look deeper within himself, a necessary step to overhaul Christian's fundamentally flawed body, a metamorphosis requiring time, luck, and considerable effort. He planned to utilize the medical skills he'd painstakingly mastered as the Divine Doctor, combined with a bone compression art he'd adapted from body modification techniques learned, of all places, in a circus. Finally, the various magic stones he possessed made the entire process feasible. He hadn't expected to acquire such expensive stones so readily, chalking it up to the strange priorities of an elite clan willing to indulge even a good-for-nothing's requests, a stark contrast to the struggles he and Evan had endured for similar resources in his past life. He began the process, starting with a white magic stone designed to purify toxins. This required the tedious work of cleansing every trace of toxin buildup throughout his body using white mana. It was a delicate process where the smallest error could trigger excruciating pain. An intense surge of energy coursed through him as the purification commenced. Despite the inherent risks and precision required, Chris smirked inwardly. To him, this was a cakewalk. In Count Khazar's opulent office, Cox reported Christian's obedient entry into the punishment cave. The Count, however, worried, wondering if sending his son to such a harsh place, known to break even strong fiends, was a mistake. He recalled Christian's bright, promising childhood and lamented the sudden, drastic downturn that led him to his current state. Was it arrogance born from talent, or was something else that caused such a fall? Regardless, Khazar harbored a dark thought. Better for Christian to be utterly broken or even perish than continue living such a wretched existence, his eyes hardening with resolve. Christian's recent bold words about proving himself through actions echoed, but Khazar quickly dismissed any flicker of hope, reminding himself of the countless deceptions he'd already endured. He questioned Cox about Christian's entry, asking if anything seemed unusual. Cox hesitated before complying with the demand for a full report, revealing Christian had taken several magic stones inside, including a dreamstone known for inducing hallucinations. Concerned about unknown side effects, Cox suggested opening the cave immediately. Khazar's response was swift and cold. No, if Christian had resorted to such tricks, he should be left to face the consequences, even death. 1 month passed. Count Khazar stood before the imposing doors of the punishment cave, fully expecting to find his son mentally shattered. As the heavy doors ground open, Khazar's jaw dropped in shock. Emerging from the darkness wasn't a broken wreck, but a refreshed and confident Chris, who greeted his father with a sharp gaze, stating he had been waiting. He casually asked if his father was surprised, then pointedly tapped his foot, reminding the Count he had promised to return a changed man. Khazar scrutinized his son, recognizing a clarity and focus in his eyes unseen since Christian's early childhood. The Count acknowledged that Chris had indeed endured the month-long ordeal. Chris cheekily asked if that counted as a compliment. Khazar warned him against arrogance, stating flatly that trust had not yet been earned. Chris internally sighed at the old man's rigidity, but knew he just had to work harder. Chris reflected on his time inside. Khazar likely assumed he barely survived, but the reality was far different. He'd been too busy training to feel bored. Using the white mana stone, he had optimized Christian's body, preparing it for advanced swordplay, feeling life surge through every cell. The Dreamstone, which the butler Cox had nervously tried to prevent him from taking, proved instrumental. Its hallucinatory effects, rather than breaking him, drastically accelerated his body's metamorphosis, allowing him to forge not one, but 2 mana cores, one of light, one of darkness. Theoretically, this made him incredibly powerful. He demonstrated his control by casting a simple light spell, internally preening at his own genius. Naturally, he kept the light core hidden using his darkness core. The fiends wouldn't appreciate its existence. However, there was an unexpected twist. He discovered the Dreamstone wasn't just any Dreamstone. It was subtly altered. Someone had given it to him, likely hoping the amplified hallucinations would destroy his mind. Seeing this clumsy attempt to break him only fueled Chris's determination. He decided then and there to use this attack as a stepping stone for his own advancement. Back before the cave entrance, having fulfilled his part of the bargain, Chris formally made his request. Khazar curtly permitted him to speak. Chris asked for permission to use the Black Swamp Knight's training ground. Khazar instantly balked, declaring a good-for-nothing had no business there. The grounds were reserved for the elite knights of one of the dark magic clan's 3 orders. Chris clarified he merely wished to borrow the grounds, suggesting observing the knight's bravery would positively influence him, assuring his father he had no intention of joining their order. After a moment's pause, Khazar reluctantly agreed, warning Christians sternly not to bring disgrace upon them. Chris acknowledged the warning. Khazar then mentioned the second request Chris had made. Later, Chris arrived at the bustling Black Swamp Knight's training facility, a place teeming with various fiends and warriors. Adjusting his gloves, he immediately heard disparaging murmurs identifying him as the foolish young master, noting their lack of deference. Understandable in the magic empire where strength often trumps status. Besides training observation, he admitted to himself there was another crucial reason for being here. His second request had been for access to the House Khazar library. Access required a letter of recommendation from the Knight's deputy commander, Melon, a condition Khazar imposed, repository of all their dark magic grimoires likely because, as Khazar had reminded him with exasperation, Christian previously tried selling advanced family grimoires on the black market for pathetic prices. Chris mentally facepalmed at the sheer stupidity of his body's previous owner. Gaining Melon's recognition was now his top priority. Just then, a familiar, unwelcome voice cut through the crowd. Thurn, Christian's younger brother, had arrived with his own entourage. Him again, Chris thought with irritation, finding the boy troublesome. He considered the interruption, then a slight smirk touched his lips. Actually, this encounter might present a perfect opportunity. Thurn issued a final, pointed warning, ordering Chris back immediately and implying he shouldn't waste the life he barely salvaged from the cave. Chris, however, calmly questioned if Thurn could truly back up such threats. He then dropped the bombshell that their father had personally granted him permission to be there, leaving Thurn utterly stunned. Though visibly respecting the Count's decision, her presence was heavy as she declared Chris untrustworthy, simultaneously releasing a palpable wave of 4-star dark energy intended to intimidate him. Thurn stepped aside as Deputy Commander Melon appeared. Chris recognized the pressure tactic, noting he was quite used to such threats. He offered a polite greeting to the Deputy Commander. Melon's eyes widened slightly in surprise as Chris remained completely unaffected by her energy display. Seeing the Deputy Commander involved, Chris stated he would now prove his qualification to use the training ground. Melon asked how he intended to do that. Thurn, ever the model student, proposed a challenge. Chris should fight and defeat one of the assembled fiends. Chris agreed with a smirk, confirming it wasn't a joke, but added a condition. Claiming his debauched lifestyle limited his dark energy capacity, he requested his opponent refrain from using such powers, preferring an unarmed duel instead. Melon found the request troublesome, openly doubting Chris could possibly win a purely physical fight. Chris simply replied they would have to wait and see, scanning the crowd for a suitable opponent. His eyes landed decisively. He pointed directly at Thurn. His younger brother reacted with predictable fury, sputtering in disbelief at the audacity. Melon advised Chris to choose someone else, pointing out that Thurn was already a 2-star fiend, an exceptional achievement for his young age. Chris acknowledged Thurn's talent, but countered that he wasn't exactly an ordinary individual either. He insisted that fighting Thurn, someone stronger than the average recruit, was the best way to prove his worth. Looking Thurn dead in the eye, he goaded him, asking if he was scared. Thurn, predictably, accepted the duel with gritted teeth. A crowd quickly gathered, eager for the spectacle, many openly hoping Thurn would teach his arrogant brother a harsh lesson. Chris then asked Melon about the rules for victory. Annoyed by his insolence, Melon declared the fight would continue until one combatant was fully incapacitated, privately hoping Thurn would inflict serious injury. Chris turned to Thurn with a mocking grin, asking if he heard the rules clearly, implying a beatdown was coming his way. Thurn roared back, promising to silence Chris permanently. The instant Thurn finished his threat, Chris moved. He landed a clean punch, reminding his shocked brother that the fight had already begun. Thurn stumbled back. Ignoring Thurn's enraged shouts, Chris easily dodged, internally conceding the barehanded rule heavily favored him. While still technically zero-star in Fiend terms, his physical combat prowess, honed over a lifetime, was far beyond Thurn's. He struck again, leveraging battle experience Thurn couldn't comprehend. He also possessed a hidden trump card. His light powers, refined in the cave, already put him at a 3-star level. Thurn's companions watched, stunned, as Thurn hit the ground hard. Chris loomed over him, teasingly asking if he was crying. Thurn, shaking, demanded to know what trick was used. Chris relished his brother's confusion, denying any trick and simply asking if perhaps Thurn was just weak. He cupped his ear mockingly. Pushed too far, Thurn gathered dark energy, screaming he would kill Chris as he lunged. Chris noted the improved speed, but easily caught the fist, smothering the dark energy with his own. Thurn stared, aghast, at his neutralized attack. Before Thurn could recover, Chris unleashed a brutal uppercut, remarking that fighting was about instinct. Thurn was violently thrown backward, crashing onto the dirt. The crowd gasped, quickly rationalizing that Thurn must have held back out of caution. Melon watched the scene unfold, her expression unreadable but hinting at doubt. Chris stood above the fallen Thurn, a faint aura around him, and addressed Melon, asking if this display was sufficient proof of his qualification. Melon gave a curt nod of affirmation. Chris thanked her politely. Internally, he smiled. Everything had gone according to plan. Now, the real work of devouring knowledge, both martial and magical, could begin. Back within the familiar, ornate walls of his assigned room, Chris assessed his recent gains. He had officially reached the 1-star level in dark magic. Progress felt slower than anticipated, hampered by his unfamiliarity with the energy and the lingering dregs left behind by Christian's neglectful past. Simultaneously wielding his light power would require reaching a higher overall level first. Deciding it was time for refreshment, he rang a small service bell. In response, a translucent blue spirit materialized. Marie, Christian's assigned maid, disturbingly a high-level banshee, inquired if her lord required assistance. Chris internally noted the absurdity of using such a potent spirit for housekeeping. Another legacy of Christian's chaotic existence that likely prevented her proper use elsewhere. He made a mental note to find a replacement later, then requested some juice before resuming his training. Marie floated closer, eerily suggesting juice made from human blood. Chris, decidedly not a vampire wannabe, firmly specified strawberry instead. The banshee seemed disturbingly keen on the blood option, forcing Chris to vocally reiterate his preference for fruit over bodily fluids. With that settled, Chris headed out, intending to train. However, Cox, the ever-present butler, intercepted him, expressing feigned concern that the young master might be overdoing it. Cox followed this with a declaration of his unwavering belief in Christian, even when everyone else had given up. Chris scoffed internally at the blatant brown-nosing. Annoyed by the sycophantic display, Chris sharply questioned Cox's authority to dispense belief or judgment. The half-vampire butler immediately backpedaled, offering apologies for overstepping and wishing the young master well. Cox retreated down the hall, leaving Chris watching him go, a growing suspicion solidifying in his mind about the butler's true motives. Arriving at the training grounds under the bright sky, Chris noticed a subtle shift. The assembled knights and fiends regarded him with less hostility than before. Their guards were down. Seeing an opening, Chris decided it was time to start winning them over, albeit unconventionally. He dropped his practice bag and approached a bird-like knight. The knight quickly moved to report his presence, informing Deputy Commander Melon inside her command tent. The knight reported young Master Christian's arrival. Melon remained silent, contemplating. What was Christian plotting now? The duel still baffled her. Thurn's movements had been impressive, undoubtedly, Yet Christian had somehow dispelled his dark energy at the perfect moment. Did he possess an innate understanding of combat flow? The thought briefly arose that Christian's latent talent might even rival the direct heir, Lord Eskid. But she crushed the thought. Christian was a ruined bastard, his potential squandered, his dark energy pathways damaged. Recovering from that seemed impossible. Hearing a commotion outside, Melon emerged. A knight nervously explained that the young master was involved in another conflict, this time with a squire. The crowd looked on as the squire, Cannon, lay defeated, a recognized one-star fiend. Melon stared, shocked. Had Christian also achieved 1 star? Chris seized the moment, loudly proclaiming his disappointment with the famed Black Swamp Knights, declaring their reputation overblown. He then directly challenged the onlookers, asking if anyone else dared to face him, deliberately taunting them by questioning if they were cowards. His words hit their mark, angering several knights. A large, purple-skinned fiend stepped forward, introducing himself as Torin. Chris smirked. They had fallen right into his trap, just as planned. He coolly invited Torin to begin. He knew they'd never willingly teach their secret techniques to someone like Christian. If they wouldn't teach, he would simply have to steal the knowledge through combat. Torin attacked fiercely. Chris parried, carefully observing his opponent's grip and fluid footwork. This was the mud swordsmanship of rumors. He considered mimicking the style as he engaged Torin. Melon watched, her eyes widening slightly at Chris's defense. Chris allowed a confident smirk. A few exchanges later, Torin was on the ground. Chris perched victoriously atop him. Melon and the surrounding knights were dumbfounded. How was Christian, the failure, suddenly this strong? How had he reached 1 star when his core was supposedly ruined? Melon felt a prickle of certainty. Her initial assessment of his hidden depths hadn't been entirely wrong. Chris addressed the stunned crowd again, deriding the knights' skills and casting blame upon their deputy commander for their weakness. The knights bristled with fury. Melon, regaining composure, warned Chris not to get carried away by his victory. Ignoring her, Chris turned his full attention to the deputy commander. He issued a direct challenge. Perhaps she could personally demonstrate the true skills of the Black Swamp Knights. Melon furiously stated 1 second was enough for him. Chris proposed they limit dark energy to 1 star and use wooden swords. Melon scoffed at the 1 star limit, boasting she'd break his legs with half that. Chris accepted putting his legs on the line. Melon agreed, vowing he wouldn't walk away. The duel began fiercely. Chris blocked Melon's rapid strikes, a whirlwind of wooden clashes ensuing. Onlookers noted Chris was holding his own. Melon grew frustrated. Her attacks weren't connecting properly. This shouldn't be happening. Chris taunted that things weren't going her way. Melon angrily told him to shut up, imbuing her sword with energy. She unleashed a powerful magic-infused strike, shattering the ground. Chris saw his opening now. He dodged under the blow and delivered a surprise headbutt. Melon staggered back, stunned, blood trickling from her nose. Chris coolly stated it worked. He deduced Melon was a spell's word. Binding her magic limited her defense, creating an opening physical power alone could exploit. Melon suddenly burst into laughter, acknowledging she'd underestimated him and would now focus. She then pointed out the fight wasn't quite over. He'd scratched her neck during the headbutt, hinting at potential poison laced in his nails. Still, she accepted defeat and asked his desire, requesting a rematch in return. Chris agreed to the rematch if she met a second request. He considered his options, then demanded she kneel before him. Melon refused, stating her loyalty was to House Baron. Chris countered, revealing his ambition to become the young lord himself, suggesting her loyalty might shift. Melon was shocked at the declaration. Becoming young lord was near impossible for a branch member. Chris smirked, noting no rule explicitly forbade it, and accepted her duel request anyway. He proposed a rematch occur in 1 month, needing training time himself, but with limitations next time. Melon retorted he'd have no chance then. Chris cryptically replied few things were truly impossible, promising to show her where her loyalty should lie in a month. Later, Chris presented Count Khazar with Melon's recommendation letter. Melon reported to the Count that the fiends needed more training, admitting the young master was a genius who defeated stronger opponents, including herself. She confessed it was a rare, enjoyable fight. The Count looked at Chris with newfound, albeit hidden, consideration, though Chris pretended not to notice. Keeping his promise, Khazar granted Chris the golden library key. Chris stood before the door, internally celebrating his success. Quest complete. Melon, a powerful 6-star fiend from the main family, was crucial for his plans to control the Dark Magic clan. He was confident he could fully win her over within the month, because, well, he was a genius. Thinking of the Count, Chris wondered if the brief look he saw was fatherly pride. Perhaps fiends had familial bonds after all, maybe even better than his last dad. He vowed not to disappoint his father. Inside the vast library, shelves overflowed with texts on blood magic, summoning, and curses, all forbidden knowledge in the dominion of light. As he reached for a book, a familiar spirit appeared. Marie, the banshee maid, startled him, revealing with a flourish that she was once the librarian here. She coyly asked if he wanted her as a personal servant girl, maybe for some private study sessions. Chris, blushing slightly despite himself, told her to shut up. Marie declared his directness made her heart pound. Exasperated, Chris yelled for her to shut up already, his voice echoing slightly as Marie giggled. Marie noted the grimoire Chris chose contained a 4-star binding seal. She doubted he could comprehend such advanced magic yet. Chris shrugged dismissively, simply stating he was a genius. Marie looked thoughtful for a moment, then gushed about how handsome and intelligent he was, laying it on thick. Chris told her not to force the compliments. Marie inquired why he specifically chose that book. Chris smirked, replying he needed to catch a rat. While pretending to train intensely, Chris considered his suspects. The first was Thurn, who despised him most openly. The second was Cox, the butler. Despite not being clan, Cox had unusual access and sycophantic behavior. It could also be an unknown third party. Regardless, someone wanted his downfall, evidenced by the Dr. Dreamstone. Perhaps, Chris mused, he should act like the bastard they expected. Whoever enjoyed his regression would be the culprit. He feigned frustration with the difficult training, abruptly declared he quit, and stormed off, leaving the others bewildered. Later, Chris made a scene at dinner. Christian, his father, roared as Chris complained about the food, demanding it be remade immediately. Khazar sighed, calling himself a fool for hoping Christian had matured. He left the dining room wordlessly. Chris felt slightly bad, but justified it for the family's sake. Fully embracing his returned bastard role, call him the devil maybe. He worked hard spreading rumors of his relapse, bullying maids, and wasting money lavishly. He even pretended to throw a fit over non-alcoholic wine. Marie playfully denied him real wine. He cursed her fake wine. She reminded him he was underage, but he retorted that didn't matter for a good-for-nothing bastard. Marie softly asked if he decided to be a bastard again, yet promised to stay by his side. Chris then prepared the binding seal spell. Marie gasped, amazed he'd mastered it already. Chris puffed up, reminding her of his genius status, explaining he'd modified it for lower levels. He hadn't been slacking, but mastering various spells diligently. Marie looked genuinely astonished, wondering if he truly was a genius. Just then, Thurn arrived. Chris quickly feigned drunkenness. Thurn furiously questioned his brother's relapse after seeing improvement. Observing Thurn's genuine anger, Chris internally crossed him off the suspect list. He dropped the act, telling Thurn there was a rat in the house. Thurn asked what he meant. Chris explained someone sought his downfall, and he was playing along, confirming even the wine was fake. Thurn demanded to know who the rat was. Chris admitted it was hard to say yet, but expected them to take the bait soon. He then loudly complained about the wine again, ordering a servant to fetch Cox for another bottle. The servant stammered Cox was preoccupied. Chris feigned another hiccup, deciding to visit Cox himself. He found Cox in his office and slammed the fake wine bottle down. Cox nervously asked what brought him there. Chris poured the non-wine over Cox's head, asking if this was the wine he requested, accusing the butler of looking down on him. Cox frantically denied it, promising to fetch the proper wine. Chris refused, ordering Cox to get it himself. Cox protested he was busy. Chris pointed out Cox needed a change anyway and patted his shoulder dismissively. Cox gritted his teeth but promised to return shortly. He left the room. Chris commended the butler's patience but noted the hidden hostility. While Cox was gone, Chris quickly examined the documents on the desk, finding discrepancies in the finances. Bingo! He figured the butler, if guilty, would be involved in shady finances. This wasn't a smoking gun yet, just suspicious records. Cox returned with the requested wine, assuring Chris he wasn't angry. Chris hiccuped, calling Cox his favorite and praising him effusively. Cox bowed gratefully. Then, Cox mentioned he had a message. Certain friends wished to meet Chris in secret at the usual place. Cox quickly added he disapproved of these friends but wouldn't judge. Chris pretended to consider it, then agreed to the meeting. Things were progressing better than expected. Chris arrived at the usual place, a room with drinks and food laid out. His supposed friends greeted him, mentioning rumors of change but dismissing them, declaring Chris the best among them. Chris sat silently beside a nervous young girl. He internally judged his companions as trash for making the girl serve drinks. One offered him a glass, urging him to drink. Instead, Chris flung the drink into the man's face. The spluttering man demanded to know what Chris was doing. Chris coldly accused him of tainting the alcohol. Noting his reaction confirmed he knew it was drugged. Wisps of magic gathered around Chris's hand as he touched the girl's forehead, confirming she'd been drugged. She collapsed unconscious. Chris revealed she knew dark magic too. He swiftly kicked the other accomplice aside, stating it wasn't time for surprises. He pinned the larger man down. Chris forcefully interrogated the man, whose screams echoed briefly. Chris calmly demanded to know why they were doing this, smiling menacingly. He drew a dagger, threatening death. Amidst the wreckage of the table, the two accomplices, now tied up, begged for their lives. One confessed they were ordered to drug Chris and frame him after killing the girl, coerced due to their secret drug dealing. Chris demanded the name of their employer. When the man hesitated, Chris brought the knife threateningly close to his groin. The man shrieked that it was Cox, pleading for mercy. Chris demanded they swear absolute obedience. They swore loudly, desperate. Chris prepared the binding seal. He cast the spell, searing runes onto their minds and commanding obedience, leaving them subdued. Cox burst into Count Khazar's office, reporting a problem. He claimed Christian had committed murder. Cox explained Christian allegedly got drunk, killed the serving girl, and dumped the body. The Count looked grim. This couldn't be overlooked. He ordered Christian brought to the Fiend Court, invoking his authority for an immediate trial. Cox had a satisfied smirk. In the grand hall turned courtroom, Chris stood before the Count and declared his innocence. The Count mentioned witnesses, but Chris denied the event ever occurred. He suggested a misunderstanding and presented the very much alive servant girl. His captured friends reacted in shock. The girl testified Chris had saved her and paid her rent. She then pointed at the two captives, accusing them of drugging Chris's drink. Confusion rippled through the onlookers. Chris prepared the seal again, ready for the climax. The seal activated on the captives' foreheads. Under its influence, they confessed. Butler Cox ordered them to frame the young master. Cox erupted, shouting it was slander and a frame job by Chris. Chris calmly noted he expected such a reaction. As the victim, he requested permission to directly question Cox himself, acting as the Count's proxy. The Count considered, then granted the request with a warning about inappropriate conduct. Chris promised a quick conclusion. He formally addressed the court, invoking the authority of the Demon Emperor, the Dark Magic Clan, and Count Khazar. He asked Cox to swear to answer truthfully. Cox swore. Chris repeated the request, invoking the Emperor again. Cox swore a second time, triggering the binding seal. Cox cried out, clutching his head, staring in terror. Onlookers murmured about the four-star magic. Chris explained his modified seal required 2 oaths. Cox walked right into it, like a moth to a very binding flame. Cox understood too late. Under the seal's compulsion, Chris demanded why Cox hired the thugs. Cox admitted he received an order. Someone knew of his long-term corruption and threatened him, telling him to ruin Christian since childhood. Chris confirmed he knew about the embezzlement. He demanded the mastermind's name. As Cox hesitated, Chris increased the pressure. Cox finally screamed it was Sir Eskid, the second son of the main Baron family. Cox panicked, realizing Eskid would kill him. Chris drew his sword. In a flash, Cox was silenced permanently. The Count stared, stunned. Silence fell. Chris stood over the body, stating he had punished the sinner using the Count's borrowed authority. With Cox's body lying still, Count Khazar demanded an explanation for the execution. Chris explained that leaving Cox alive would invite a cover-up from the main Baron family. Indulgence towards them was not an option, Chris stated, looking at his bloodied hand. He intended to ensure everyone remembered the truth. Eskid tried to sabotage him, a fact that visibly unsettled the Count. The Count shrouded himself in dark energy and beckoned Chris to follow. They moved to a secret training ground, away from the courtroom's prying eyes. The Count questioned if Chris meant Eskid would escalate trouble due to the succession conflict. Chris confirmed, and the Count acknowledged the correctness, if hasty nature, of Chris's decision, noting a family's power relies on their chosen successor. He mentioned supporting the first young lady, dismissing the first young lord as a lunatic. Chris declared he had another option. He himself would become the successor. The Count initially called it nonsense, but Chris reminded him of the rule, allowing branch family members with ability to succeed. The Count countered that the rule wasn't truly enforced, asking why Eskid targeted Chris. He admitted Chris might have lagged behind Eskid despite early talent. Chris vowed to catch up quickly and requested his father's help. Specifically, Chris asked for a recommendation to participate in the Sacred Dark Rite in 2 months. The Count pointed out the 2-star requirement, reminding Chris he'd only just reached 1 star. Chris confidently promised to achieve 2-star within the time frame, asking his father for help with a determined grin. Word spread through the mansion. The young master had truly changed. Staff gossiped about the Count personally training him with methods that challenged even senior knights. During training, Chris demonstrated combining mud swordsmanship to bind and black scythe swordsmanship to sever. The Count was stunned. He'd only just started teaching the black scythe technique that day, yet Chris understood immediately. Chris questioned the need to keep the techniques separate, suggesting a more efficient method. He demonstrated against a training dummy, striking it down. The Count noted the dummy's limbs could deflect mud swordsmanship. Chris explained he used mud swordsmanship, but wrapped it in black scythe energy. The Count, shocked, noted a 1-star shouldn't manage that, pondering the difficulty of using curses simultaneously. Chris cheekily dismissed it as super easy, barely an inconvenience, leaving his father speechless. 15 days later, Chris lay exhausted on the training ground. Running was tough, but stamina was crucial for advancement. Melon appeared, reminding him the duel wasn't far off, and she eagerly awaited it. Chris acknowledged her point, but mentally noted his incredible growth, though Melon warned failure meant no kneeling. Chris affirmed he'd learned something regardless. Melon hoped he'd push his limits and entertain her. Chris considered the power gap. Melon was upper 4-star, while he was upper 1-star, tiers apart. However, he smirked, remembering he was a rich wallet warrior. Later, Chris asked Marie if she'd packed his bag for an outing. Marie, beautifully dressed, expressed excitement for their first outing together. Chris protested. He never said she was coming. Marie feigned concern about heatstroke, prompting Chris's exasperation about a banshee getting heatstroke. He asked his father if he could change attendance, but the Count refused due to the master-servant contract. Chris desperately asked how to avoid it. The Count unhelpfully suggested a deep kiss, reminding Chris he was drunk when he made the contract, leading Chris to curse his past self. He told Marie she couldn't come to a crowded place. Marie looked crestfallen, mentioning her spiritual energy might harm people, and how she'd been stuck for decades. Guilt, Chris relented, allowing her to come if she stayed hidden. Marie cheered. As they left, she asked where they were going. Chris replied cryptically, "Somewhere make a profit." She told him he already rich, but he declared that wasn't a lot. When Marie guessed land or gold, Chris simply said it was for something he used before. As Chris prepared for his outing, Thurn appeared, commenting on his lateness and demanding to know his purpose. Thurn announced he was there as a chaperone, just in case Chris reverted to his old ways. Chris casually reassured him, flashing a mental image of himself looking like a high roller, declaring he was merely off to do some gambling. Thurn was aghast. Chris justified it, stating fiends naturally enjoyed such vices, even claiming gambling was legal and recommended by the Demon Emperor himself. Hearing this, Thurn insisted on accompanying him. Chris feigned surprise and teased his younger brother about being worried. Thurn flushed, denying it vehemently, and claiming he was only concerned about Chris dishonoring the family. Chris mocked him further, calling him a nerd and wondering aloud if simple card games would be too much stimulation. Thurn, provoked, vowed to flatten Chris's cocky nose as their carriage departed. Chris smirked inwardly, thinking his sweet summer child of a brother was the perfect pushover for the day's plan. They arrived at an opulent building. Both Thurn and the hidden Marie were impressed, Marie expressing her excitement. Chris chided Thurn for acting like a country bumpkin and handed him a tiger mask, explaining they needed to conceal their identities to enter. He then instructed Marie to remain hidden and leaned in to whisper instructions, outlining his scheme. Marie giggled and vanished, agreeing to his orders. Chris donned his own intricate mask, dismissing Thurn's question about Marie's whereabouts as they headed inside. The casino floor was filled with masked patrons at various tables. Chris and Thurn walked through the lavish space, taking in the scene. Nearby, two masked men noted their arrival, sneering about fresh suckers walking into the lion's den. Chris turned to Thurn and proposed a bet on who could win more money within an hour. If Thurn won, Chris would respectfully call him older brother for a month. If Chris won, however, Thurn would have to address him as Honorable King Emperor Majesty Brother. Chris offered Thurn some starting money, teasing him about being scared. Thurn snatched the pouch indignantly and stormed off to play first. Thurn quickly won a hand of cards. The dealer announced his victory, and another gambler encouraged him, remarking on his apparent skill. Meanwhile, Chris played roulette, seemingly enjoying good luck. He knew the casino's standard practice. Let beginners win small amounts initially to foster overconfidence before aiming for a large, crushing loss. Just as Chris reflected on the common's methods, Thurn cried out in frustration, unable to believe he'd lost with what he thought was a good hand. Chris saw his brother was already hooked. Chris approached Thurn, suggesting he cut his losses and go home. Thurn shot back, asking wasn't Chris losing too? Chris admitted to losing a mere 500 rupees, while Thurn confessed to being down 1,000. Other gamblers subtly eyed Thurn. Chris noted his brother was now marked as a sucker, anticipating a skilled con man would soon reel him in. He asked if Thurn intended to continue, holding out the money pouch again. Thurn grabbed it defiantly. Chris mentally wished him luck losing tons, reminding him he tried to stop him, perfectly setting Thurn up as bait. Sure enough, a con man soon sidled up to Thurn's table. Bingo! Marie reappeared, reporting she had located the men Chris had asked about. He commended her work. In the background, Thurn wailed dramatically over losing 10,000 rupees. Marie led Chris to a separate mansion nearby. As Marie opened the door, they were confronted by two guards, one a beast man, demanding their identities. Chris removed his mask, coolly asking if they didn't recognize him. The guards stuttered, realizing it was the young master, and Chris demanded they fetch their master. Grantel, the master of the Grantel Merchant Guild, appeared, greeting Chris warmly. Chris requested a private chat, acknowledging Grantel's reputation, but internally knowing he also owned the casino. He then coldly accused Grantel of conning his brother. Grantel paled, realizing the naive sucker in the tiger mask was Count Khazar's heir. Chris confirmed it. Grantel tried desperately to distance himself from the actions of his dealers, but Chris silenced him with a wave of killing intent, asking point-blank if he wanted to die. Grantel immediately groveled, apologizing profusely and begging for mercy. Chris asked if his apology was sincere. Grantel assured him it was, offering compensation. Chris demanded 1,000,000 rupees. When Grantel protested, he didn't have it on hand. Chris lowered the price to 200,000. Grantel tearfully agreed, lamenting it was his entire fortune. Chris then stated there was something else he required. Later, Chris examined several swords, battle gear acquired using the extorted money. Marie praised his super scheme, and Chris smugly agreed. Marie pointed out one particular dark sword, Grenade, a notorious cursed holy sword once wielded by a fallen hero, now rusty but still desired by fiends. Marie expressed concern about its state, but Chris assured her it was all part of the plan. He then surprised Marie by presenting her with a beautiful necklace, the item she had seemed interested in earlier. He called it a gift, explaining awkwardly that he felt she wouldn't find peace without it. Marie was deeply moved, confessing it was the first gift she'd ever received, before or after death. She thanked him sincerely. Satisfied, Chris decided it was time to head home. Marie beamed, addressing him as my lord. She enthusiastically promised to make him even tastier blood juice as thanks. Chris recoiled, stating he wouldn't drink that, and asked her to stop making horrifying jokes about the strawberry juice he'd been consuming. As they walked away, Chris felt he was forgetting something important, but decided he'd remember later. Back at the casino, a dejected Thurn was shown betting his last rupee. The following morning, a furious shout of "Brother!" erupted outside the Khazar estate. The noise startled Chris from his sleep. His younger brother, Thurn, stormed into the room, livid. He accused Chris of abandoning him at the casino the previous night, revealing he had nearly been sold into debt slavery because of it. Chris blinked, finally remembering the small detail he'd overlooked, his brother. Thurn explained that only Grantel recognizing him had saved him from that fate. Chris mumbled an apology, internally noting that the casino owner must have intervened after their little chat. Thurn wasn't finished. He sternly reminded Chris of their bet, stating that since Chris had clearly lost more money, he had to fulfill his promise. With barely contained outrage, Thurn demanded Chris address him using the absurdly long title they'd agreed upon. Esteemed King Emperor Majesty Brother. He clenched his fist, waiting. Chris, however, merely looked bored and began picking his nose, pretending not to understand. Thurn sputtered, trying to get the words out again, before finally losing his temper completely and screaming the ridiculous title with surprising force. Chris beamed, patting his brother condescendingly and praising him for keeping his word, reminding him to always strive for such respectfulness. Utterly humiliated, Thurn vowed revenge before storming out, telling Chris to prepare himself. Watching him leave, Chris reflected calmly. This adorable kid was destined to kill the original Christian. He suspected the influence wasn't entirely Thurn's own, likely stemming from Eskid, the powerful rank one young lord of the main dark magic clan. Chris felt no personal animosity towards Eskid, not being the real Christian, but knew a confrontation was inevitable if he wanted to claim the title of young lord himself. He decided he would eventually settle this brotherly grudge Eskid seemed determined to create. However, achieving that required power and allies, foremost among them being Melon. His thoughts drifted to the sword he'd acquired, Grenade. He knelt, picking up the dark, chain-bound blade. It was a legendary holy sword, desired by countless fiends, yet none had ever been able to wield it due to its inherent holy nature rejecting their dark energy, reducing it to a mere antique. Chris smirked, deciding to test its reaction to him. As his gloved hand closed around the hilt, the sword flared with golden light, resisting his touch. His hand shook slightly against the force. It rejected dark energy, just as expected of a holy artifact. Still, it was just a weapon. He figured he could use it if he understood why it rejected dark energy. He retrieved a set of specialized tools, which bore a striking resemblance to hammers, from his bag, their metal surfaces gleaming. Then, with intense focus, he began forcefully striking the sword's hilt with a hammer. Percussive maintenance, the universal fix. He paused his work momentarily, asking the sword if it hurt. Wielding a hammer in each hand now, he told the stubborn blade to just submit already. He grinned wickedly, informing the sword he planned on hitting it all night long. Grenades seemed to vibrate slightly in response. A few days later, Chris arrived at the secret training grounds. His father, Thurn, and a surprisingly familiar woman were waiting. The Count asked if his preparations were complete. Chris confirmed, then turned his attention to the woman, recognizing her elegant attire, but unable to immediately place her. Playing it safe, he offered a formal greeting to the Knight Commander of the Black Shadow Knights. The woman, introduced as Marion, the commander, acknowledged him coolly as her nephew. Chris recalled she was his father's older sister, daughter of the Elder Clan head, tasked with overseeing the clan's clandestine operations. Definitely an elite. He wondered why such a high-ranking figure was there. Count Khazar explained Marion was visiting unofficially about the Cock situation. Marion added with dry amusement that Chris had certainly committed a cheeky act. Chris inwardly scoffed, wondering if the Elder Clan head planned to protect Eskid, deeming it a trivial matter for someone of his stature. Marion read his thoughts, stating the Elder Clan head cared little for childish rivalries. Rather, she revealed the Elder Clan head was interested in Chris himself. Chris instantly saw this as a valuable opportunity. Marion, however, openly questioned his sanity, calling his challenge to Melon before reaching 2-star rank borderline idiotic. She suggested he call off the duel. Chris politely declined, thanking her for her concern while gesturing with a now seemingly subdued grenade, stating he had his plans. Marion's eyes widened as she recognized the infamous blade. She declared him utterly insane, far worse than she had imagined. His father attempted to defend him, mentioning his recent changes, but Marion cut him off, pointing out the absurdity of using a holy sword in a duel. Chris countered nonchalantly, asking if using it was against the rules. Wasn't winning all that mattered, no matter the method? Marion sighed heavily, warning him that even the Elder Clan head had failed to tame Grenade. Its holy power would incinerate him. Chris unwrapped the binding slightly, musing aloud about how dangerous that sounded. Then, with a surge of controlled energy, he made the sword glow with a contained golden light, startling Marion. They both stared at the weapon, now quiet in his grasp. Skeptical, Marion asked if it was a fake. Chris invited her to check. The moment she grasped the hilt, Grenade erupted in violent, untamed holy energy, throwing her backwards. "How are you doing that?" she demanded, stunned. Chris simply called it a trade secret, holding the now calm sword effortlessly. He declared, with utmost confidence, that the only reason he could wield it when the Elder Clan head could not was simple, because I am a genius. Marion looked completely dumbfounded, while Count Khazar appeared slightly flustered, perhaps even impressed. Marion broke the silence with sudden laughter, remarking that the young master was certainly entertaining. At that moment, Melon arrived through a portal, immediately noticing Chris holding the tamed holy sword. She shrugged, asking why it mattered. With a fierce grin, she declared that today would be his last day in this world anyway. Chris met her murderous intent with a steady, unnerving calm. With deadly intent gleaming in her eyes, Melon surged forward, her dark energy coalescing around her weapon. She struck with immense force, her attack clashing violently against Chris's blade. Chris held firm with Grenade, noting that without restrictions, Melon's power and speed were far greater than before. He knew he couldn't conventionally bridge the raw power gap between them. As her dark energy slammed into the holy sword, Grenade flared with golden light, visibly opposing the fiendish power. Marion and Count Khazar watched intently, surprised as the holy power actively pushed back against Melon's assault. Melon scoffed, remarking that Chris hadn't surpassed her even when they were younger, but Chris knew this wasn't the end. Marion pointed out his movements, how he subtly shifted to accommodate the holy sword's nature. The clash continued, dark and holy energy crackling where they met. Melon grunted as the repulsive force hit her directly. Count Khazar observed the incredible power Chris wielded, though he thought his son's dark energy seemed unstable. Marion corrected him, explaining that Chris was meticulously controlling his dark energy, adjusting it moment by moment to prevent the sword's rejection. The duelists broke apart, circling each other as the ground cracked beneath them. Melon, slightly breathless, asked if the battle was to his liking, suspecting he was predicting her movements. Chris simply smiled, admitting he happened to be quite observant. He explained that every technique has a tell, a preceding posture, requiring specific muscle movements in the shoulders and upper body. This fundamental truth applied to novices and experts alike, Melon realized. Changing tactics, Melon gathered a swirling green, corrosive energy in her hand. Preparing a spell, she reminded Chris that the Black Swamp Nights were spells words. A bright flash erupted from Chris's chest as he activated a cleansing artifact, neutralizing the incoming spell. Melon stared, recognizing the artifact. Chris cheerily thanked his father for the borrowed item, claiming he survived thanks to it. Count Khazar looked bewildered, recognizing the artifact that should have been locked in the secret vault. Chris cheekily whispered to Thurn that he was prone to thievery sometimes. Melon conceded that having good equipment was a skill in itself, before Chris suddenly flicked a small, dark marble into the air. Melon reacted instantly, unleashing a powerful beam attack towards it. Chris noted there was no use dodging this one. The marble detonated upon impact, creating a massive, fiery explosion. Chris casually admired the effect of the corrosion marble, another acquisition funded by Grantel's extorted money. He called out into the smoke and flames, knowing Melon was still alive, challenging her to come out. Chris stood ready with grenade as Melon charged out of the inferno, her clothes partially burned away but her fighting spirit blazing. He held grenade at bay, smiling fiercely. Count Khazar looked proud, telling Marion his son was indeed a genius. Melon stepped out of the lingering fire, breathing heavily but looking exhilarated. A feral grin spread across her face. She declared the fight was too much fun and eagerly asked what he would attack with next. Marion watched with alarm, worrying Melon had lost herself in the battle frenzy and needed to be stopped. Chris remained calm, channeling dark energy. He met Melon's next strike not with the sword, but with his open palm, coated in purple energy. He smoothly deflected her attack, shocking Melon as his foot slid back gracefully. Before she could recover, Chris closed the distance, locking her blade with grenade and pressing the holy sword against her neck. He declared his victory, asking if the duel was satisfying enough for her. Melon stared for a moment, blood trickling from her lip where he'd struck her. The Count and Marion looked on, impressed. Then, Melon burst into laughter. She asked if he was genuinely asking, admitting she was too exhilarated to calm down. Chris smiled, reminding her of his request for her allegiance, stating he wouldn't force loyalty even though he won. Melon grew serious, asking if she stood by him. Would he continue to fight her like this in the future? Chris promised she could fight him as much as she wanted. Without hesitation, Melon knelt, pledging her loyalty. Later, Marion gazed out the window at the setting sun, contemplating Chris's unusual control over dark energy. In a memory, she recalled reporting her findings about grenade to the Elder Clan head, who refused to attempt wielding it again. He explained that while he could wield it momentarily, the constantly changing waves of dark energy made sustained control impossible. One would need to perpetually alter their energy waves to avoid the sword's detection, a feat deemed impossible in a real fight. The clan head mused that perhaps only a demon lord, a demonic dragon, or hypothetically, some crazy bastard who could control dark energy as easily as breathing could manage it. Back in the present, Chris cheekily asked Marion if his performance earned her praise. Marion looked thoughtful. Perhaps, she mused, her father's long-held desire could finally be fulfilled. In the bustling Khazar kitchen, various staff, including orc chefs, prepare meals. One orc chef chopped ingredients with focused intensity, specifically slicing fresh strawberries. These were then meticulously arranged atop a heart-shaped cake. Observing nearby, Marie commented on the orc chef's surprising top-notch skills, while Chris looked mildly disgusted at the sight of yet another strawberry creation. The orc chef, Chwick, noticed them and asked what brought the young master to the kitchen. Chris announced his intention to bake some cookies. Marie looked intrigued, and Chris explained they were a gift for someone. Marie immediately grew suspicious, demanding to know if they were for a woman other than her. Chris, flustered, quickly denied it, adding that the recipient was technically female. Chwick offered to bake the cookies for him, but Chris politely refused, stating that baking heartfelt snacks with his own hands was what mattered. As Chris spoke, a splash of red liquid hit his face, residue from the other orc chefs who were violently mashing what used to be strawberries into a pulp for juice. Chris yelped, demanding to know if they'd added blood to the strawberry juice this time. Marie just offered a knowing oh ho ho. That did little to reassure him. Perhaps Marie's definition of strawberry juice involved more iron than expected. Later, as Lady Marian prepared to depart with Count Khazar, Chris hurried outside, calling her name. Marian paused, asking what was the matter. Chris explained he'd heard she was leaving and came to bid her farewell, presenting a neatly wrapped box. Marian thanked him. Acknowledging the duel must have left him tired. Chris brushed it off, stating he wasn't tired at all, and offered the box as a small gift. Inside was an assortment of cookies. Marian cleared her throat, slightly flustered, remarking that a gift wasn't necessary. Chris insisted he was simply happy to see her again. Count Khazar, watching the exchange, connected the dots, realizing Chris must have sought him out the previous day to inquire about Marian's preferences, a commendable effort to win favor. Chris urged Marian to try one, proudly stating he'd bake them himself. Surprised, Marian took a bite. Her eyes widened. They were delicious. She composed herself, confirming they were indeed very tasty, much to Chris's satisfaction. Feeling obliged, Marian offered to grant Chris a wish in return for the fine gift. Chris requested that, from now on, she become his true aunt. Marian understood there was a deeper meaning behind his words, confirming she knew he was participating in the sacred dark rite, and correctly guessing he sought her support in the succession conflict. Unfortunately, she had to refuse, explaining the rule mandated impartiality from main family adults. Chris quickly changed his tune, insisting it was merely a genuine request to grow closer to her. Marian looked skeptical. Chris then added, with exaggerated innocence, that of course, if his dear aunt cherished him enough to offer secret help, he certainly wouldn't refuse it, batting his eyelashes for effect. Marian chuckled, taking another cookie. She admitted she didn't dislike his honesty and couldn't help but cherish a nephew who baked such treats. Chris beamed, thanking his aunt. Marian then asked if she could expect more cookies, to which Chris slyly replied that it depended on her. He winked, warning that making him sad might cause him to sulk and forget the recipe. Marian gave a subtle, amused smile. She then formally offered Chris a position in the Black Shadow Knights, citing his exceptional duel against Melon. She praised his potential, suggesting he might even surpass the Elder Clan head, but warned his rivals were formidable and worried his talent might be snuffed out prematurely. Chris remained unfazed. He stated bluntly that failure wasn't an option he'd live with, surprising Marian with his resolve. He appreciated her concern, but declared confidently that he didn't intend to lose. Marian noted his unreasonable confidence, but seemed swayed, acknowledging his fiendish nature and accepting his chosen path. Mounting her horse, she offered one final piece of advice. Be wary of the first young lady, Julianne. When Count Khazar questioned this, Marian simply stated Chris would understand in time. Chris thanked her, promising to keep it in mind. With a final farewell, Marian departed. Later that evening, Chris lay sprawled on his bed, lost in thought. He considered the immense power of his six-star father and aunt, yet recalled hearing little about them during the Great War. The magic empire clearly held countless powerful combatants. He remembered the overwhelming forces arrayed against the dominion of light and knew he couldn't allow history to repeat itself. He clenched his fist with renewed determination. He had to get stronger, faster. 1 month later, Chris stood before his father's desk. Count Khazar adjusted his monocle, confirming he had summoned him. With a look of grave importance, Count Khazar stared, adjusting his monocle as he absorbed the change in his son. He asked, incredulous, if Chris had truly reached the 2-star rank already. The speed of such growth in only a month was astonishing. Chris merely smiled, questioning his father's surprise, since he had promised exactly this. He then inquired about the purpose of the late-night summons. The Count gestured towards a sealed letter on his desk, explaining he had received word from the main family. He had recommended both Chris and Thurn for the upcoming Sacred Dark Rite, but the main family had only approved Thurn. The reason cited, the Count continued with a grimace, was Chris's recent string of carefully fabricated misdeeds, frivolous spending, supposed womanizing, drunken destruction of property, and even thievery. Internally, Chris winced. His act had been too convincing, and the accusations were technically true, even if orchestrated. Count Khazar, however, fumed, genuinely angered that the main family dared to look down on his son, regardless of the reports. Chris, wiping a trace of blood from his lip, calmly asked if Viscount Langham had made the decision. The Count shook his head, explaining Langham had little influence after Eskid's recent disgrace. The objection came primarily from Loin de Baron, a direct descendant known as the rising star of the main family and a favorite for the upcoming rite. The Sacred Dark Rite, Chris recalled, was a crucial event where candidates absorbed pure darkness from the negative dimension. Since the amount of darkness was limited, participation was decided by hierarchy, effectively a quasi-death match. Higher-ranking candidates claimed more darkness, significantly influencing their selection prospects as a young lord, a successor candidate for the clan head. If Loin dominated the rite, Chris knew achieving his own goal of becoming the 6th young lord would become considerably harder. Count Khazar offered to appeal the decision, even suggesting involving Marion. Chris waved off the offer, stating it wasn't necessary. He would figure things out himself. His father acknowledged his talent and recent change, but placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, advising him to leave such political maneuvering to the adults. Chris smiled faintly, appreciating the gesture. However, a devious glint entered his eyes as he mentioned having methods of his own, making the Count lean forward inquisitively. Changing the subject, Chris asked if any children from Count Tyreman's house were participating. His father confirmed Tyreman's 3rd son would be there, launching into an angry tirade about how that scoundrel Tyreman had sided with Loin and declared Chris unfit for the rite, dismissing him as a mere trickster only capable of controlling demon beasts. Chris noted silently that his father was surprisingly doting. He urged his father to calm down, reminding him that he simply needed to prove himself. Conveniently, the Tyreman family was hosting a black pill hunt soon. He declared his intention. He would participate in their hunt as a herder. Meanwhile, in the main family's grand estate, Marion reported her assessment of Christian to the elder clan head. Asked for his impression, Marion stated unequivocally that Christian was incomparable to others. The clan head tapped his cane, finding her assessment hard to believe, recalling the boy as a brat, a false prodigy. Marion insisted he was clearly different now. The clan head then asked the pivotal question: could this child fulfill his long-desired wish? Marion reflected on that wish, the sole reason her father clung to life, even resorting to heaven-defying magic to refuse death. She admitted she couldn't say for sure, but Chris was the closest possibility she had seen. Intrigued, the clan head mused that Chris's participation in the rite seemed unlikely according to clan consensus and asked if Marion planned to intervene. He immediately dismissed the idea, stating he wouldn't step in over such a trivial matter. A fierce beast must overcome small trials alone. Marion started to argue that Chris was still just a child who deserved the chance, but a sharp glance from her father silenced her. She lowered her gaze. The clan head noted he was always harder on those he held expectations for, acknowledging Marion's clear fondness for the boy. He then summoned his blood drinker. Dark energy swirled, coalescing into the impeccably dressed Simon, head butler of the dark magic clan. The clan head instructed Simon to observe Christian leading up to the rite. Simon confirmed the order, but turned to Marion with a sly smile, asking permission to pull a small prank during his monitoring. The clan head curtly warned him not to go overboard. Simon licked his pointed fangs with delight before vanishing as quickly as he appeared. Marion watched him go, a sliver of worry remaining for her nephew. Later, Chris rode through town in his carriage, reflecting on his progress. Reaching 2-star was quick thanks to his innate talent, but his stamina and dark energy reserves were still insufficient to push for 3-star. He needed a black pill to rapidly accumulate dark energy. These pills were rare, typically harvested from powerful demon beasts like the Karma Fiend, which the Tyraman family coincidentally planned to hunt. However, simply catching the beast wasn't enough. A specific condition had to be met. His carriage stopped before Grantel's residence. Chris stepped out, greeting the sweating merchant. Grantel nervously asked if Chris had come empty-handed. Of course not, Grantel stammered, hastily producing a small gift, a meager bag of coins that fell to the ground. Chris looked down at it with utter contempt, telling Grantel he clearly didn't know his place. He leaned in, reminding the merchant of his various illegal activities. Tax evasion, kidnapping, swindling, before Grantel desperately asked what he wanted. Chris offered leniency if Grantel cleaned up his act, adding he needed something, an ash pill. Grantel paled, mentioning the item's recent price surge on the black market. Chris just gave him a look that clearly said, "Make it happen." He then called for Marie, asking if she was ready. Marie appeared, her face contorted into a terrifying, torture-ready expression, complete with sharp implements, causing Grantel to shriek in terror. The merchant immediately capitulated, promising to procure the pill right away. Chris commented on how easy things were when people cooperated. As an afterthought, he requested an armor-piercing dagger as well. With a final "see ya," Chris departed, leaving Grantel to collapse and curse his name. In the carriage, Marie asked if they were heading home. Chris replied he had one more stop. He instructed the coachman to stop outside a small shop displaying a potion sign. Entering the warmly lit establishment, Chris perused the shelves before pointing to an item offered by the shopkeeper, indicating he would take it. Chris stood inside the small potion shop, Marie hovering nearby. Both eyed the item on the counter with a mixture of unease and slight disgust. Marie giggled, asking her lord if it was perhaps that time already. Chris shot her an annoyed look, firmly stating it wasn't okay. Marie feigned understanding, but Chris repeated more forcefully that it really wasn't okay. He clarified the purchase wasn't for him. It had a use for someone else. Marie's expression turned serious, speculating if it could be for the Count. The nervous shopkeeper overheard, muttering about needing to ensure the Count was taken care of, given his age. The shopkeeper then stressed the need for absolute secrecy for the Count's honor, prompting Chris to assure him of his discretion. Outside, Count Khazar and Thurn waited by the carriage. The Count prompted Thurn, reminding him about Chris's title. Thurn, clearly pained, muttered the ridiculously long honorific, "My honorable King Emperor Majesty Brother." Looking genuinely concerned, Thurn mentioned hearing the black pill hunt was dangerous and advised Chris to be careful. Chris couldn't resist teasing him about his sudden worry. Thurn flushed, denying it, and insisting he was merely concerned they wouldn't get their proper duel if Chris was injured. Count Khazar cut them off, ending the squabble and telling Chris to go flatten the Tyraman bastards' noses. Chris confidently promised to return with refreshing news. As Chris boarded the carriage, the Count curiously asked Thurn about the King Emperor business, but Thurn mumbled that he didn't need to know. Arriving at the house of Count Tyraman, they were stopped at the gates by a sneering goblin attendant who stated they weren't allowed entry. Chris's knight companion bristled, angrily demanding if the goblin knew who Chris was after keeping them waiting. The goblin confirmed young Master Aloys had ordered it, adding that Aloys owed no favors to a good-for-nothing bastard. Chris's eyes narrowed dangerously as he stepped forward, asking if the attendant dared suggest he find his own accommodations. The goblin nervously affirmed this. The knight offered to immediately retrieve the goblin's head, but Chris stopped him, asking the goblin about payment instead. The goblin suggested sending the bill to Count Tyreman. A cold smile touched Chris's lips. Soon after, they stood before a magnificent, sparkling clean mansion, clearly expensive. Chris strolled towards the entrance, followed by his knight and the now-sweating goblin hauling luggage. The goblin nervously inquired about the cost. The knight smugly informed him it was at least 100,000 rupees, while Chris casually remarked how enjoyable it was to spend someone else's money so freely. He gave everyone an hour to settle in before they went out for drinks. Suddenly, Chris paused, thinking he heard a sound from the luggage. Marie popped out exuberantly, declaring the mansion super and perfect for serving her lord. Chris demanded to know how she got there. Marie explained she hid in his luggage to fulfill her promise, teasing him about being shy. Chris denied missing her, looking away flustered. Just then, Aloys Tyreman, the third son, burst onto the scene, furiously waving a bill. Chris greeted the protagonist of the hunt informally, asking if something was wrong since Aloys had told him to find his own place. He explained that since a mere hotel wasn't suitable, he purchased this passable mansion, subtly mocking Aloys for haggling over mere money. He added that considering Aloys' pathetic guest treatment, the mansion's cost was a cheap price for a lesson in manners. Enraged, Aloys crumpled the bill, purple, thorny energy erupting around him. He summoned a large, shadowy panther via his family subjugation arts, asking Chris if he truly wanted to die. Chris recognized the technique. Unlike alliance taming, subjugation arts bound beasts through fear, using complex formulas to paralyze reason and induce delusions. Chris knew it was too complex to fully analyze quickly, deciding to just beat the living shit out of the beast for now. He asked Marie for a weapon to deal with the scary kitty. Marie produced a simple wooden staff. Chris took it, beckoning Aloys to come at him like a real fiend. Aloys spat insults, ordering his panther Chaco to attack. The beast lunged, jaws wide. Chris met the attack head-on with the staff, which promptly splintered from a force. Chris was thrown back, but landed smoothly, remarking it wasn't shabby, but questioning if 2-on-1 was fair play. Aloys sneered that Chris wouldn't participate as a herder now. If he won, he'd be a guard, needing that much just to make ends meet, calling Chris a cheap friend. Furious, Aloys cursed him and vowed to make him kneel. They charged again, slamming into the ground where Chris had been, finding only cracked paving stones. Aloys looked around wildly before Chris appeared behind him, bringing the broken staff down on his head with a resounding bonk. He followed with several more rapid strikes. Chris landed lightly, asking if it hurt, but warning Aloys not to cry, as he wouldn't go easy on him. Aloys furiously told him to shut his mouth. Chris stood over him, an illusion of the grim Reaper briefly flickering behind him. The panther, Chaco, seemed confused, its subjugation momentarily disrupted, hissing uncertainly. Aloys cradled his head, yelling indignantly about Chris hurting his Chaco. Chris feigned innocence, stating it was merely a 2-star illusion spell, mocking Aloys' pathetic arts for being unable to overcome it. Aloys roared, gathering dark energy for a transformation, summoning spectral nightmare steeds. Chris interrupted, asking if Aloys knew the defining trait of trash bastards. Before Aloys could react, Chris lashed out with a blindingly fast strike, catching Aloys across the face and sending him crashing to the ground, his transformation fizzling out. Chris smirked, reminding the defeated noble that real fighters don't wait around for flashy transformations or long casting times. As the nightmare horses whimpered and faded, Chris continued his charade, mimicking the instructions for a popular children's game. Go. Drop. A concerned servant asked if the young master was certain he could handle the gambling. Chris, leaning back nonchalantly amid scattered cards and chips, assured him there was plenty of time left, stating he should rest when he could. The servant pointed out he wasn't exactly resting right now. Chris retorted defensively, asking what was wrong with a good-for-nothing guy acting like one, seeking backup from Marie. Marie giggled, agreeing everything was fine, as long as the young master avoided actual alcohol, gesturing towards his glass of ginger ale. Chris internally lamented his craving for real alcohol instead of the fizzy substitute. Meanwhile, Alloy's Tyraman's retainers, a beastman and a goblin, watched from a distance, the goblin grumbling about why their master wanted them watching such a bastard. Chris spotted them and waved them over, inviting them to join the table. He leaned in conspiratorially, assuring them their master wouldn't wake until tomorrow after the beating Chris gave him, promising secrecy with a playful finger to his lips. The retainers reacted with shock and anger. Chris casually told them to mind their own business, adding they should have fun watching him instead. He loudly declared his intention to deal the cards and drink their share of the alcohol, while the servant nervously vowed not to go easy on him this time. Later, under the cover of night, the two retainers observed Chris slumped over the table, apparently passed out drunk amidst the gambling paraphernalia. The goblin scoffed, confirming Chris was indeed a good-for-nothing and declaring it pointless to watch any longer. They decided to leave and make their report. As soon as they were gone, Chris's eyes snapped open. He sat up, shedding the drunken act instantly, and moved to the window, watching the annoying pests depart. It was late, time to get moving. He retrieved a small bag, telling Marie he needed to go somewhere quickly and instructing her not to follow. Marie looked momentarily confused before realizing Chris was carrying the aphrodisiac he'd purchased earlier. She blushed, asking if he was going to use it now, much to Chris's shock. He vehemently denied it, but Marie gave him 2 thumbs up, offering to cheer for his nighttime activities while sadly unable to attend him in bed. Chris yelled at her to stop running her mouth, reminding her this comic was rated PG. Marie clearly needed to install an ad blocker in her brain sometimes. Chris journeyed into the dark Khitan Mountains, arriving at the secret Tyraman hunting grounds. He noted the dense, demonic energy, living up to its reputation. He figured the specific hunting ground location should be close. Pushing aside some bushes, he spotted a fortified camp ahead. Only 2 guards stood watch, surprisingly lacked security. Recalling the invisibility spell Marie taught him, he activated it, shrouding himself in faint turquoise energy. Marie's voice echoed playfully in his mind, asking what he planned to do with invisibility magic. Chris mentally groaned, wondering why she always misinterpreted things like that. He slipped past the guards easily and continued deeper into the woods under the cloak of invisibility, eventually discovering a clearing dominated by an ancient, eerie altar bathed in moonlight. This had to be the final stage location for the black pill hunt. The problem remained: how to obtain the pill. He recalled Lena's explanation. A carriage-off beast must offer its life willingly. In essence, one had to terrify the creature so profoundly it preferred death, using extreme fear to manipulate its essence. Just as opposites are connected, intense fear and radiant joy occupy the same spectrum. In that fleeting moment of ultimate terror bordering on ecstatic release, the useless ash pill transforms into the coveted black pill. This specialization in fear was why House Tyraman hosted the hunt. Chris initially planned to learn their subjugation arts, dose the carriage off with the aphrodisiac mixed with other substances to make it uncontrollably feral, and seize the resulting black pill. But learning the complex technique took too long. He needed another way. Suddenly, a powerful wave of malice washed over him. Someone was nearby. He moved swiftly through the trees, guided by the ominous feeling and adjusting his hood. He followed the sensation, his boots crunching softly on the ground, deeper into the mountains until he found the source, a dark, forbidding cave entrance. He cautiously entered, descending into the chasm. The intense malice radiating from the depths was undeniable. Intricate, glowing red runes covered the walls, top-rank barrier dark magic. A horrifying realization dawned on him. This was a crevice of Gehenna, a direct rift linking the human world to the world of demons. He surveyed the unsettling, rune-covered depths. Then, an idea sparked. What if he lured the carriage off here? He even had the perfect bait, the aphrodisiac. A confident smile spread across his face. He couldn't wait for the hunt now. He turned and walked deeper into the crevice. Elsewhere, the bat-winged butler Simon materialized, reporting to an unseen master. He commented with amusement that he hadn't expected the little bastard Christian to be so interesting. He recounted how Chris had pummeled the Tyraman brat, deceived the observers with his act, and then secretly entered a forbidden area, apparently scheming something. This display made Simon eager to play an even more terrible prank on him. The designated hunting ground unfolded under a bright sky, a lush expanse of forest and distant mountains. Aloy's Tyraman planted his flagstaff firmly into the earth, his retainers arrayed beside him, projecting an air of authority. Chris couldn't resist a jab, remarking on Aloy's attempt to look cool despite the previous thrashing Chris gave him. Predictably, Aloy sputtered, demanding silence. He then sneered, calling Chris the real poser for bringing grenade, a sword Aloy insisted he couldn't even wield. Chris casually retorted that grenade was far more effective than a mere club, offering a demonstration that made Aloy visibly flinch. Ignoring Chris, Aloy ordered the herders to begin luring the carriage off towards the designated altar, while his guards were instructed to follow him. Chris noted a small, almost hidden figure perched high in a nearby tree, observing the proceedings. Impatient, Aloy demanded Chris acknowledge the orders, which Chris did with dismissive agreement. The group stood near the dilapidated altar steps. One of Aloy's beast-eared retainers told Chris pointedly to stay aside, warning he'd only obstruct the hunt. Chris amiably agreed to laze about, adding a sarcastic caution not to come crying for help later when they inevitably mess things up. The retainer surged forward in rage, only to be restrained by Aloy, who advised against wasting energy before the hunt even began. Aloy then dismissively ordered Chris, the good-for-nothing, to guard the flag. Chris settled against a tree with feigned laziness, mockingly wishing them luck. Internally, however, he smirked, confident they were walking right into his trap. He had thoughtfully packed the dagger, and ash pill extorted from Grantel, anticipating this exact scenario. Aloy and his retainer moved off, casting wary glances back. Suddenly, Chris's senses sharpened. Something was approaching. The target emerged, a carriage off, a form magic demon beast. Chris blinked, taken aback. For a fearsome creature, it looked surprisingly derpy, like a rejected Muppet auditioning for a monster role. The beast made peculiar croaking sounds as the retainer checked if young Master Aloy was ready. With a nod from Aloy, the retainer urged him to commence the subjugation art. Purple, runic energy flared around Aloy as he initiated the technique, directing the dark magic towards the carriage off while his retainers launched supporting attacks. The beast paused, sniffing the air, its eyes suddenly flaring with crimson rage as the aphrodisiac clearly took effect. The subjugation art backfired spectacularly. Aloy expressed a shock just before the enraged carriage-off slammed him violently into the ground. The beast-eared retainer rushed to his master's side, anxiously checking his condition. A poisonous aura began emanating from the agitated carriage-off. The retainers reacted swiftly, throwing up a defensive magic formation. Yet, the carriage-off hammered relentlessly against their shields, pecking furiously. An observer noted the futility. The aphrodisiac had driven the beast beyond simple control. Aloy, recovering, wiped his mouth, acknowledging they'd taken an antidote beforehand, but recognizing the danger if the fight prolonged. One retainer rallied the others, urging them to stop the beast with everything they had. Their efforts were useless as the carriage-off rampaged, tossing them aside like rag dolls. Another desperate cry warned Aloys, who braced himself, sweat beading on his brow, steeling his resolve. Just as the beast lunged again, Chris intervened, effortlessly catching the creature. He remarked dryly on House Tyraman's pathetic display, needing the supposedly useless flag bearer to step in. Chris then made a typically outrageous offer. He'd bail Aloys out, but only if Aloys promised to call him Big Bro. Aloys, predictably, exploded in curses. Chris simply pressed him, questioning what Aloys planned to do, reminding him time was running short. Nearby, other retainers were already succumbing to the poison, collapsing and coughing. Aloys gritted his teeth, caught between pride and desperation, before finally yelling at the bastard Chris to just help him. Chris agreed easily, reminding Aloys to keep his promise. Chris lunged, grappling with the carriage off. Dark, thorny chains erupted from his control, binding the beast in a manner shockingly similar to subjugation arts. Aloys stared, dumbfounded, questioning how Chris could possibly use such techniques. Chris scoffed at his rival's ignorance, stating that intermediate subjugation art wasn't some rare secret known only to backwater nobles like the Tyraman. Holding the struggling carriage off fast, Chris grabbed the magical chains and leaped, dragging the creature towards the ominous crevice of Gehenna. Aloys shouted in alarm, realizing Chris's suicidal destination. Chris merely offered a parting smirk before plunging himself and the beast into the dark abyss. Landing deep within the crevice, surrounded by swirling demonic malice and glowing sigils, Chris held the panting, still-bound carriage off. He leaned in, asking the beast if this was its first encounter with the true terror of Gehenna, urging it to be properly terrified now. The beast's eyes reflected the horrifying abyss, shifting from rage to pure, primal fear, the pupils dilating and turning yellow. Seizing the moment, Chris declared it was time. He drew the dagger and plunged it deep into the terrified creature's core. Moments later, Aloys and his shaken retainers descended into the chasm, calling out anxiously to Chris. Aloys, still catching his breath, warned that the cave was extremely dangerous and they needed to leave immediately. Chris, extracting the spoils from the slain carriage off, told Aloys not to be such a wimp. When Aloys asked what they were supposed to do now, Chris examined the pulsating orb in his bloodied hands. His expression soured slightly. It turned out to be merely an ash pill, not the coveted black pill he truly sought. Chris held up the pulsating orb, confirming to a dismayed Aloys that it was merely an ash pill, not the black pill they sought. Aloys stared blankly for a moment, before erupting, blaming Chris for interfering and demanding to know what they should do now. Chris simply told him to let it go. Unexpectedly, Aloys, looking away with a blush, awkwardly thanked Chris for rescuing his subordinates, admitting they finished the hunt without major injury because of him. Chris acknowledged the thanks, though internally he felt a twinge of guilt, knowing he was the culprit who had swapped the real black pill for the ash pill he now held. Clearing his throat, Chris decided to press his advantage, reminding Aloys of their promise and demanding to be called Big Bro. Aloys reacted with predictable outrage. Chris nonchalantly asked if Aloys intended to go back on his word. Aloys stammered, denying the promise and pointing out the age difference. Before the argument could escalate, a menacing pressure filled the crevice. Aloys and his retainers looked around nervously, sensing the shift as the demonic energy intensified. From the deeper shadows emerged a hulking silhouette with glowing eyes. Chris's own eyes widened slightly. It had been some time since he'd encountered a true plaything from the depths. A powerful demon of Gehenna stood before them. Showing surprising concern, Aloys urged Chris, an outsider, to flee and save himself. Chris, however, glanced toward a specific point high on the cave wall, spotting the lingering observer, Simon. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the bloody dagger spinning through the air, embedding it precisely in the rock near the hidden figure as a clear warning shot. Simon materialized from the shadows, catching the dagger with amusement. He acknowledged Chris's awareness, admitting he'd planned to observe longer before intervening with the demon. Considering the risk, especially if the demon pushed its limits, Simon noted he couldn't teleport everyone out if he arrived too late. With a final thought about Chris's intriguing schemes, Simon vanished in a streak of red energy, leaving the dagger quivering in the rock. Chris smirked, explaining simply that he disliked being peeked at. The demon laughed, mocking Chris's concern as futile for a dead man. Chris quickly assessed his opponent. Compared to the monsters from the Age of Destruction, this was a low-ranking demon, yet easily 5-star, far too strong for his current level. Deciding he couldn't have witnesses, Chris moved. He swiftly subdued Aloys's retainers with a wave of soporific magic. Aloys protested, demanding to know why Chris was making them fall asleep when they needed to fight together, showing surprising resistance to the magic. Chris clicked his tongue, told him to stop talking and go to sleep, then struck him sharply on the stomach. Aloys finally crumpled. The demon watched this, bemused, asking if Chris intended to offer the humans as sacrifices. It magnanimously offered to spare Chris's life and grant a blessing in exchange. Chris scoffed, telling the demon it sure liked to yap. He drew grenade, stating it was his principle never to associate with its kind. The demon recognized the holy sword but sneered, calling the idea commendable but ultimately useless. A holy sword wielded by a fiend was merely junk. It blasted Chris with dark energy. The impact sent Chris staggering back, blood trickling from his mouth, yet he stood firm, glaring defiance. The demon repeated its offer, sacrifice the humans for his insignificant life. Chris met its gaze. Calling Chris a pest, the demon moved to finish him, but Chris retorted, questioning who decided he couldn't use the holy sword. He dashed forward, parrying the demon's attacks with grenade. Concentrating, Chris channeled energy from the true black pill, hidden away earlier, into the holy sword. Grenade responded, erupting in a blinding, pure golden light. The demon recoiled in shock and disbelief, unable to comprehend how a fiend could wield the power of light. Chris smirked, asking if the demon finally felt its life was in danger. Enraged, the demon gathered its power, roaring its intent to slaughter him. A massive ball of dark energy formed. Chris braced himself, raising the incandescent grenade and invoking a legendary technique, Dead Sea Cleaving Light. A torrential wave of holy power surged from the blade, striking the demon. It stared, uttering a final sound of disbelief before being utterly consumed and disintegrated by the overwhelming light. The light faded, leaving Chris panting heavily, blood staining his clothes and face. He acknowledged grimly that he'd pushed his body too hard, before collapsing onto the cavern floor, his consciousness fading. Flashback, a younger Chris sparred with Evan. Evan looked stunned, asking if Chris had truly just replicated his Dead Sea Cleaving Light after seeing it once. Chris demonstrated the form imperfectly, confirming it. Evan sighed, remarking that Chris truly was something else. He explained the technique signified the single flash of light dividing the mythical Dead Sea. Ironically, Evan reflected, despite wielding that light, he himself had failed to become the guiding light for his own clan. But looking at Chris, Evan expressed his firm belief that Chris would surely become the light that would save the world. Present, as Chris lay unconscious in the demon-tainted crevice, an ethereal, feminine hand reached down towards him from a ripple in space-time. A disembodied, shimmering presence observed him, finding the entire situation deeply interesting. Chris awoke with a groan inside the opulent manor of Count Tyraman. He sat up in bed, realizing with annoyance that 2 whole days had passed while he was unconscious, a complete waste of time. Still, a quick check confirmed his body felt fine. More importantly, he reached for the pouch beside his bed. The precious black pill was thankfully still secure. He recalled the mysterious entity, Mefina, that had appeared, realizing he had attracted some unwanted, high-level attention. While fiends occasionally receive the demon's blessing for rapid growth, Chris dismissed the idea. That path was usually for villains, and besides, he doubted a seventh world demon was truly that powerful anyway. A knock preceded the door opening, revealing Count Tyraman, Aloys trailing behind him. The Count inquired about Christian's condition upon hearing he was awake. Chris moved to offer a formal greeting, but the Count waved him down, asking him just to listen. Chris looked puzzled. The Count explained that an investigation squad had checked the cave yesterday. It appeared someone had tampered with the magic circle sealing the entrance to Gehenna. Fortunately, they concluded the demon encountered must have been reverse summoned during the tampering, disappearing shortly after. The Count grimly added that even that fleeting moment was enough time for everyone to have lost their lives. Chris processed this, realizing they believed it was a reverse summon. It was a convenient excuse, saving him the trouble of explaining how he actually extinguished the demon. Count Tyraman paused for a moment, then began with an apology for treating Chris poorly based solely on his undeserved reputation as a good-for-nothing. He bowed deeply, expressing sincere gratitude and declaring Chris a benefactor of House Tyraman. Chris waved it off with a practiced smile, stating that as a member of the Dark Magic clan, he merely did what was necessary, emphasizing their shared connection as family. Internally, he decided to muddy the waters further. If he couldn't get the black pill directly, manipulating the situation was the next best thing. The word family seemed to resonate with the Count. Recovering, Count Tyraman offered his assistance, promising to help Chris with anything within his power. Chris considered this, then made his request. He hoped House Tyraman would shake off the old grudges against House Khazar. He envisioned a new dynamic, replacing the tense, enemy-like relations with a friendly rivalry, allowing for proper advancement together, befitting their kinship. Chris added that the Count surely knew the reason for their feud. It was a scheme orchestrated by the main clan, pitting the branch families against each other to prevent them from uniting and becoming a threat, keeping them as mere guard dogs. The Count, startled, asked if Chris was suggesting a revolt against the main clan. Chris denied having any such thoughts. He simply believed they shouldn't be pushed around for something the main clan did wrong. The Count seemed impressed by Chris's foresight. Chris thanked him for the praise, asking if his request would be accepted. The Count agreed, resolving to contact Chris's father, Ridden, that punk, for the first time in a while. Chris allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Uniting forces like this, one step at a time, was crucial for establishing a firmer front against the coming age of destruction. The Count then nudged his son, reminding Aloys that he also had something to say. Aloys cleared his throat awkwardly and presented the ash pill. He explained he found it on the cave floor after Chris passed out and had kept it safe. Chris immediately teased him, suggesting that if Aloys was so grateful, he could give him many more things. Aloys predictably shouted in frustration. Count Tyraman laughed heartily, deciding that since he was so grateful, he would offer a gift, a summoning stone necklace capable of storing a rank 4 demon beast. Chris recognized it as an incredibly rare item. Furthermore, the Count promised to file a report ensuring Chris could participate in the Sacred Dark Rite, wishing him good results. Chris expressed his thanks for both the gift and the encouragement. With a final instruction for Chris to rest up, the Count and Aloys departed. Chris watched them go, a thoughtful expression on his face. Once the door closed, he called out into the empty room, suggesting it was time for his hidden guest to emerge. Simon materialized smoothly from the shadows, acknowledging that Chris had indeed discovered him. Wondering how Chris had seen through his stealth, a feat even Count Tyraman couldn't manage. Chris, reflecting Simon's image in his eye, simply stated he could smell the distinct scent of blood unique to Simon. Simon introduced himself formally as the head butler of the Dark Magic clan. Chris processed the name, recalling where he'd heard it before. His fist clenched involuntarily. Simon was the infamous master of the Blood Shadow Mages, a psychotic branch known for indiscriminate slaughter, whose leader in the previous timeline reached 8 stars and became the 7th Demon King of Carnage. Chris remembered countless near-death encounters caused by that leader, not to mention Simon himself. This butler was the blood and lineage of that future demon king. Simon, meanwhile, mused aloud about how amazing the young master of House Khazar was, capable of even eliminating a demonkin. He wondered how Chris knew about the clone he'd dealt with, questioning if Chris had somehow witnessed the Dead Sea cleaving light despite being unconscious. Chris feigned ignorance, claiming he had no idea what Simon was talking about. Simon saw through the act, noting that investigators found the cave floor completely clean, with even the demunkin's corpse annihilated without a trace. It wasn't a reverse summoning. It was complete vaporization, an impressive feat. He directly asked Chris to explain how he did it. Simon added a warning that whatever Chris said would be reported to the Elder Clan head as part of an evaluation. Chris retorted, questioning why he should reveal his trump card. He stated that if he were the Elder Clan head, he wouldn't want a little nerd answering every question. He'd prefer a predator who kept their claws hidden until the very end. Simon chuckled, finding Chris truly interesting. Then, changing tack, he asked if Chris wasn't going to apologize. When Chris asked for what, Simon explained that differentiating between reverse summoning and annihilation just from trace evidence was normally difficult, which is why Count Tyreman misunderstood. However, Simon knew it was annihilation, so why did Chris believe otherwise? Chris pointed out it was simple when you thought about it. He stated directly that Simon knew because he was the summoner himself. Chris then laid out the situation, a demonkin summoning where a clan member almost died. What would happen if the Elder Clan head learned Simon was responsible for the mayhem? Simon conceded defeat, reluctantly agreeing to take responsibility and keep the matter secret, even offering a half-hearted apology. Chris dismissed the apology, instead telling Simon to remember one thing. He now owed Chris a big favor. Simon coolly asked if this constituted a deal. Chris replied that it would be great if Simon chose to understand it that way. Back in his room at the Tyreman Manor, Marie efficiently packed Chris's belongings into a magically levitating trunk. She announced the preparations for their return home were complete, and Chris gave her a nod of approval. Ready to depart, he opened the door, only to find Aloys Tyreman lingering hesitantly outside. Aloys awkwardly asked if Chris was leaving now. Before Chris could reply, Marie materialized beside him, trunk floating nearby. Chris gestured towards Aloys, reminding him to use the proper title. Aloys looked utterly baffled. Chris elaborated, stating he'd let it slide in front of the Count, but a promise was a promise. Aloys was to call him Big Bro from now on. Aloys bristled, predictably snapping back that he was 2 years older. Cutting through the pointless argument, Chris inquired if Aloys had something specific he wanted to say. Aloys admitted he came to offer a warning. He referenced Chris's earlier talk about family, stating that after hearing it, he felt it wasn't right to withhold information from kin. Aloys cautioned Chris, reminding him that young Master Loin from the main family was strongly against his participation in the sacred dark rite. He described the rite as a source of potent elixirs and blessings, where direct descendants started leagues ahead of any branch member. Aloys trailed off, implying Chris would be easy pickings. Chris interrupted with a smirk, offering a warning in return to his lil bro. He advised Aloys not to participate in the upcoming rite, stating it was for his own good. Aloys stared, shocked. He internally fumed, misinterpreting Chris's words as mockery and a ploy to monopolize the rite's pure dark energy. Chris ignored the reaction, confidently declaring that whoever his opponent might be, they would come to regret facing him in the sacred dark rite. Turning to Marie, he announced their departure, leaving Aloys sputtering indignantly. As he walked past, Chris patted Aloys on the shoulder, advising him to think carefully and avoid regrets later. Soon after, they arrived back at the imposing estate of House Khazar. Inside, Thurn learned from a worried butler that his big brother had returned only to immediately leave for the training cave, intending to train in isolation until the rite. Just then, Thurn spotted Chris heading down the corridor. Taking a deep breath, Thurn called out, forcing himself to utter the ridiculously long, previously agreed-upon title. Honorable King Emperor Majesty Brother. Chris paused, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Thurn's pride quickly resurfaced as he angrily reminded Chris of their promise to duel upon his return. Chris felt a brief flicker of surprise. Thurn had grown stronger in his absence, already reaching middle 2-star rank. Chris brushed off the duel request, claiming he was busy training. He then recalled Thurn was also participating in the rite. Delaying wouldn't do. He told Thurn they could duel after he finished training, advising his brother to train as well. Thurn insisted Chris promise not to postpone it further. With a final warning that the duel wouldn't be like their last encounter, Thurn conceded, watching Chris walk away, as he commented on the stubborn brat, like a girl he had known in his past, as she coyly asked if Chris promised her something, a blush dusting her cheeks. Chris merely smiled, remarking that Thurn reminded her. Later, alone in his stark training room, Chris sat on the bed, contemplating the black pill. He had half a month left until the rite. Taking a steadying breath, he popped the pill into his mouth. An overwhelming bitterness assaulted his senses. It tasted like regret and bad life choices rolled into one unpleasant lump. He lay back as the potent energy began to surge within him. His internal landscape filled with a turbulent, dark power, more chaotic than expected. Then, a faint glimmer appeared, a spark of light force embedded within the black pill itself. He surmised that the Karajoff's final, intense emotion, likely terror rather than elation, must have fused with the pill upon death, explaining why such items were notoriously difficult for fiends to absorb. But such difficulties were irrelevant to him. He focused his will, guiding the dark energy through his internal pathways, while isolating the light force. Most fiends would instinctively expel this conflicting power, but Chris saw no reason to waste such a valuable resource. He decided to take it all, directing the light force towards his nascent light core. The golden energy surged, spreading like luminous cracks through his system before coalescing. A bright, stable core of light settled within him, visible even in his physical eye for a moment. The internal storm subsided, leaving behind a profound stillness, occasionally punctuated by gentle motes of light. Elsewhere, in a sumptuously decorated room overlooking a sunset, a woman with fiery red hair gave permission to enter. An aide approached, presenting a scroll. He reported on the investigation she requested regarding the black pill hunt, confirming an incident involving a summoned demonkin, which Christian Khazar had survived. He apologized for the delay caused by the incident's complexity. The woman accepted the report with a simple acknowledgement of his work. As the aide took his leave, the scroll revealed a portrait sketch of Chris attached to the report. The woman, addressed as Lady Eyeline, gazed thoughtfully into it. Half a month had passed since Chris absorbed the black pill. Thurn arrived promptly at Chris's training room door, announcing it was the promised day for their duel. From within, Chris invited him to enter. Thurn stepped inside the familiar training space, but stopped short, visibly taken aback. Chris stood waiting, impeccably dressed in formal attire, a stark contrast to his usual training gear. He greeted his younger brother's early arrival, dryly asking if Thurn was really looking forward to getting pummeled again. Thurn felt an oppressive presence radiating from Chris, far stronger than just weeks before, and stammered for Chris not to make him laugh. Chris casually stated that if Thurn was desperate for a taste of his knuckle sandwich, he'd grant the wish. However, he added a condition. If Chris won, Thurn had to give up participating in the sacred dark rite. Thurn reacted with shock, demanding to know what Chris was saying. Chris reminded him that the rite was fundamentally a competition, and with cold eyes, declared that weaklings should simply stay out of it. Enraged, Thurn told him to shut up and raise his sword. Chris sighed dramatically, feigning disappointment that Thurn was blind to such obvious brotherly concern as he drew his own weapon. He supposed he would just have to pound the understanding into his stubborn brother. The confrontation was brutally short, ending with Thurn's scent flying across the room. Sometime later, Thurn sat glumly nursing his injuries, arm in a sling and face patched up, while Count Khazar stood nearby with Chris. The Count sternly told Chris he had gone overboard this time, The healer indicated Thurn would need half a month of bed rest. The Count mused aloud that this meant Thurn would inevitably miss the rite this year, forcing him to wait for the next one. Thurn weakly called out to his father in protest. Chris then requested a moment alone with his brother, which the Count granted after a brief hesitation, advising them to talk things out before leaving them. Once they were alone, Chris approached the bedridden Thurn, asking why he was pouting like a whiny baby and reminding him that he was the one who had demanded the fight. Thurn looked down, quietly asking if Chris truly disliked seeing him grow stronger. He accused Chris of constantly mocking his achievements and now deliberately injuring him just to stop him from joining the rite. Chris sighed, seeing his brother was close to tears, and tried to explain they weren't on the same page. He claimed he acted harshly in the hopes of making Thurn stronger for his sake. Chris elaborated that Thurn competing against him in the rite would mean forfeiting any chance to obtain the pure dark energy offered there, justifying his rough methods by citing Thurn's stubborn nature. More importantly, Chris continued, pure dark energy simply didn't suit Thurn. He asserted that Thurn's true potential lay with gray dark energy. Just as light power had variations, so too did dark energy. Pure dark energy was the highest attribute, but gray dark energy, especially suited for curse magic, ranked just below it. Chris pointedly asked if Thurn hadn't found mastering curse magic easier than swordsmanship. Thurn looked shocked, asking how Chris knew. Chris, unable to reveal his knowledge came from the future, smoothly lied, claiming he could discern that much just from their sparring because he too was fighting with his full capabilities. He explained that taking in pure dark energy first would actually hinder Thurn's mastery of gray dark energy later, potentially slowing his overall growth, something Chris claimed he wanted to avoid, wanting Thurn to grow strong as quickly as possible. Chris finished by sincerely advising Thurn, as an older brother looking out for his younger brother's growth, to reconsider participating in the rite. As a final gesture, he offered a gift, the ash pill he had received from Aloys. Thurn stared in disbelief, recognizing the valuable pill and demanding why Chris would give it to him. Chris waved a dismissive hand, stating it was simply because Thurn was his little brother, adding offhandedly that he had already consumed something better anyway. Thurn looked down at the pill, deeply conflicted and moved. He clutched the gift, tearfully asking why, if Chris was capable of such change, he had behaved like such an imbecile while their mother lay dying, reminding Chris of the heartache he'd caused. Chris offered no immediate answer. Thurn admitted quietly that he hadn't understood Chris back then. Chris looked away, stepping towards the bed. The scene shifted to the exterior of a grand, cathedral-like building where carriages were arriving for the sacred dark rite. Chris emerged from his carriage, stretching theatrically and complaining about the long journey and his aching body. He grumbled about the main family's pettiness for not providing a warp gate. He muttered a vow that things would change once he became clan head, only for Marie to suddenly materialize and latch onto him excitedly. She squealed about their date, her non-existent heart fluttering, prompting Chris to deadpan that she didn't actually possess a heart. He explained to a nearby retainer, who was shouting encouragement, that the main family restricted him to one companion, meaning only Marie, bound by their pact, could accompany him. As they walked towards the entrance, Chris noticed the whispers and stares of other attendees. Marie smugly noted his newfound fame. Just then, a formal greeting was directed towards Chris. Two onlookers nearby reacted with shock, recognizing the head butler, Simon, respectfully greeting the supposed good-for-nothing Christian Khazar. Simon observed Chris, remarking that he seemed to have grown even more in the short time since their last meeting. Chris retorted, asking if the Elder Clan head's aide had nothing better to occupy his time. Simon smoothly replied that he was there on direct orders from the Elder Clan head himself. He then delivered the message. The Elder Clan head wished to meet Chris personally. Chris raised an eyebrow slightly. Simon smirked, noting Chris didn't seem surprised, teasingly asking if he'd expected it. Chris flatly denied it, insisting he was plenty surprised, though his expression remained unreadable. Simon found the reaction amusing. They proceeded through opulent halls, into a vast throne room. Simon announced their arrival to the figures seated upon the throne. The elder clan had acknowledged them with a simple good. Standing beside the throne was Commander Marion. The elder clan had looked towards Chris, greeting him and remarking that it had been a while. The elder clan head, flanked by Commander Marion, acknowledged Christian's presence, remarking that it had been a while. An oppressive, almost physical weight emanated from the elder, a dominating presence that pressed down on Chris, making it difficult to even remain standing under the sheer force of his dark energy. Chris recognized the deliberate display of power, knowing the elder was fully aware his current level couldn't withstand such pressure. Steeling himself, Chris offered a formal greeting to Duke Baron, the great sovereign of the Dark Magic clan. The elder inquired if Chris was surprised by the sudden summons. Chris calmly replied that he had expected the call. The elder pressed for his reasoning. Chris confidently stated it was because a new star had appeared within the clan. The elder chuckled softly, confirming Chris's assessment and noting that neither Marion nor Simon could hold back their compliments regarding him. Yet, despite their praise, the elder confessed his own uncertainty about whether to hold any expectations. Chris remained silent, meeting his gaze steadily. The elder continued, comparing Chris to a seed. No matter how great the potential, only time would tell how it would grow. He mused that Chris could simply wither shortly after sprouting. Chris respectfully agreed, acknowledging he was still lacking compared to the elder's expectations. He countered the elder's doubt, questioning if the elder was implying he wouldn't be present in the future. Chris affirmed that only time would reveal if a sapling survives to become a great tree, perhaps even one casting its own shadow, but assured the elder he would not be disappointed. The elder seemed satisfied with the response, stating he would hold high hopes for Chris after all. With that, Chris was excused. As Chris departed, Marion quietly asked the elder for his thoughts. The elder admitted Chris was beyond his expectations, but cautioned that such great talent would inevitably bring turbulence, like the bloody winds already blowing towards the magic empire. Marion remained silent. Despite the potential chaos, the elder revealed that a small hope had sprouted within him today. Perhaps this child might finally be able to fulfill his long-desired wish. Later that evening, the grand hall glittered, filled with guests for the eve of the sacred dark rites celebration. An announcer called attention to the arrival of Count Khazar's eldest son, and Christian Van Baron Khazar made his entrance, looking sharp in his formal wear. Whispers followed him through the crowd, guests murmuring about why the elder clan head would meet with such a supposed fool, some crudely commenting he looked like a gigolo. Chris overheard them, internally sighing. He knew it, he was just too handsome for his own good. A curse, really. Marie, fluttering nearby, wholeheartedly agreed with his self-assessment. A server approached with a tray of wine glasses. Chris eyed the drinks, asking if it was booze. The server politely reminded the young master that he was underage and offered him ginger ale instead, pouring a glass for him. Chris accepted the drink, but internally seethed, cursing the lame fiends and their stupid, non-alcoholic beverages. Just then, another announcement heralded the arrival of the main family's young lords and young ladies. Large doors opened, revealing the esteemed heirs making their entrance. First came Eskid de Baron, the second young lord, followed by the elegant first young lady, Julienne de Baron, the second young lady, Jupienne de Baron, and finally the third young lord, Missac de Baron. They processed into the hall, though Chris noted with interest that the first young lord, Loin, the madman, appeared to be absent. His eyes found Eskid. He wondered what his nemesis would say now, seeing the victim of his schemes standing here. Eskid walked past without a glance, completely ignoring Chris as if he were less than an ant. Chris felt a flash of irritation at the dismissal. Suddenly, Julienne seemed to stumble slightly, brushing against Chris's arm as she passed. She offered a polite, almost imperceptible nod, continuing on her way. Recalling Marion's warning to be wary of the first young lady, Chris tried to sense any malice or hidden intent, but found nothing out of the ordinary about her. He decided it was enough recon for the day and turned to leave, intending to prepare for the rite. Before he could depart, an older gentleman with an obsequious smile intercepted him. The man introduced himself as Four, a summoner working for young Master Loin. Chris waited impassively, asking for stated he'd heard an unworthy individual was participating tomorrow and expressed concern that such an underqualified participant might cause an accident, sullying the clan's name. Chris's eyes narrowed. He asked if Four was calling him unqualified. Four replied that Chris simply needed to prove he was not. Four glanced pointedly towards where Loin presumably watched from afar. Chris met the distant gaze before turning back to Four, telling him that if Loin didn't like it, he should step up himself. Chris put down his ginger ale, stating they could have their heart-to-heart during the rite. He accepted Four's challenge to prove his qualifications, calling it barely an inconvenience. He then invited Four to show him his party tricks right then and there. Four sputtered, protesting that they were indoors and he was unarmed. Chris scoffed, asking if Four truly expected him to need a weapon for someone like him. Four hissed that Chris would regret this. Chris simply smiled, asking if he really would, suggesting Four would be the one regretting it. Nearby, Julianne observed the exchange with a placid expression, a faint smile playing on her lips. Four, Loin Summoner, didn't wait for a formal duel. Before the surrounding guests could fully react, he unleashed his power, summoning several glowing, blue evil spirits that immediately converged on Chris. Chris merely gestured nonchalantly. The summoned spirits faltered, then abruptly turned, obeying Chris instead and pinning their former master to the floor, even offering him a platter of refreshments they'd inexplicably acquired. To the astonishment of the onlookers, Four, still pinned, desperately tried to command his spirits. But with another casual flick of Chris's wrist, the evil spirits obeyed their new master instantly. Four gaped, unable to comprehend how Chris had gained control so rapidly. Chris walked past the subdued summoner, questioning aloud if that pathetic display represented young Master Loin's will. He scoffed at how unbecoming such tactics were for a direct heir, suggesting Loin should have simply challenged him directly if he had grievances. From a balcony above, Loin watched, flushed with anger, but quickly denied any involvement in the incident. Chris smirked, noting that not even a fool would believe that lie, but decided to let it slide for now, leaving the humiliated Four sputtering on the floor. Chris strode away, stating they could meet again during the rite. Loin glared after him, silently vowing to teach the cowardly brat some manners next time. The next day marked the beginning of the sacred dark rite. Participants gathered, including a noticeably pale Aloys Tyraman. He asked Chris, who was yawning nonchalantly, if he wasn't the slightest bit nervous, especially after causing a ruckus the previous day. Chris merely questioned why Aloys had come, reminding him of the warning he'd given his lil bro. Aloys sputtered indignantly about not being able to push back the rite. Ignoring Aloys' complaints, Chris walked towards the designated assembly point, adjusting his formal attire. Internally, he grumbled about Aloys, telling the brat to just wait. An official checked if everyone had assembled. A small, childlike figure with elf ears introduced himself as Sebastian, the vice butler of the main house, tasked with guiding them to the sacred ground. Sebastian tapped his staff, and the floor beneath them seemed to fracture into a kaleidoscope of light and space. The participants descended into the distorted reality. Aloys looked around in shock, asking if they were underground, but Chris dismissed the notion. It was an illusory art, materializing an imaginary space. Sebastian scurried ahead down a seemingly endless, crystalline staircase suspended in a bizarre dimension, quickly outpacing the participants. Panic erupted as the others realized they were being left behind and scrambled to follow. They traversed strange, distorted corridors and navigated across shifting, unstable platforms resembling giant fingerprints floating in the void. Some participants felt disoriented, questioning how they could be moving up a steep slope when they thought they went underground, their silhouettes struggling against the disorienting climb. The ground beneath them seemed increasingly unstable. Sebastian urged them to hurry, warning the ground wouldn't support them forever. True to his word, platforms began to crumble, sending a couple of unfortunate participants plummeting into the abyss with screams, much to the horror of those still scrambling. Sebastian cheerfully announced he would be speeding up now, vanishing ahead in a burst of speed. Moments later, the remaining stragglers were also flung off the collapsing pathway. Loin, watching Chris effortlessly keep pace without breaking a sweat, scoffed at the losers who couldn't keep up, deeming them unworthy pests. He glanced sideways at Chris, shocked at his composure. Chris met his gaze, asking if Loin was out of breath already, mocking him as all bark and no bite. He taunted Loin further, suggesting a direct air pumped full of potions should perform better. Nearby, Aloys and another participant struggled, utterly exhausted. Chris reflected on their foolishness. Exerting oneself earnestly in an illusory space was pointless. His own stamina remained untouched, thanks to a simple spell twisting the space's properties, making him essentially invincible within this realm. Sebastian, observing Chris's easy progress alongside Loin, correctly identified him. They finally arrived in a vast, dimly lit chamber with high, arched ceilings. The participants collapsed, panting heavily. Aloys, gasping for air, demanded to know why Chris was completely unscathed. Chris casually pointed out that this was why Aloys should have trained his body more instead of relying on his beast all the time. Maybe lay off the tendies too. Suddenly, a brilliant crystal materialized before them, pulsing with light. The light intensified, bathing the participants in its glow. An ethereal voice welcomed them, announcing this was the sacred ground where the purest dark energy burst forth, the sacred darkness. A figure coalesced from the light, introducing itself as Rihu, the manager of the sacred ground, welcoming the young masters and misses. Rihu, the ethereal manager of the sacred ground, formally welcomed the assembled young masters and misses. Their task today, Rihu explained, was to obtain the great pure darkness, following the path of the clan's progenitor, the third-ranked demon king, known as the Dark Destroyer. Lines of pure energy snaked across the floor, extending towards different archways as Rihu spoke. However, Rihu cautioned, the source was finite. There wasn't enough energy for everyone to share. Furthermore, demon beasts residing within the paths would test their worthiness. Chris casually raised his hand, cutting straight to the point and asking if it was simply based on who arrived first. Rihu acknowledged young Master Christian's perception was correct. When someone asked about potential conflicts, Rihu clarified that unforeseen mishaps or competitions between participants would lead to disqualification, as each participant would be on a different path and shouldn't encounter one another theoretically. Rihu emphasized avoiding conflict on the off chance they did meet, warning that wasting time only benefited competitors. A countdown began. 4, 3. Rihu advised them to focus 2 on their own safety. 1. With the final count, Loin shot forward with a smug grin, determined to seize his birthright. Rihu watched the participants depart, Sebastian hovering nearby. The diminutive butler cheekily asked Rihu if they wanted to bet some blood juice on the winner, but Rihu ignored him completely, prompting a disgruntled huff from Sebastian as he trotted off. Torches flared along a dark, stone corridor as Loin raced ahead. He soon encountered opposition. A three-headed, flame-wreathed demonic beast lunged at him. Loin met the attack head-on, unleashing a blast of purple dark energy that struck the creature squarely, causing it significant damage. He pressed his advantage, easily dispatching the beast, dismissing it as a mere low-rank 2 magic creature. Nothing to him, an upper 2-star fiend. He smirked, confident that Bastard Christian must be having a much rougher time. Loin gloated internally about his clever plan. According to the rules, each path should be identical, but he had bribed a mage to ensure only Christian's path was populated with stronger demon beasts. This place would be Christian's grave. Christian would inevitably encounter overwhelming foes by pure coincidence and meet a tragic, overlooked end as deaths during the rite were ignored. Loin finally reached a large, ornate double door, grinning triumphantly, certain he was the first to arrive at the door to the treasured ground. His triumphant expression froze. Chris was already there, leaning against the wall and asking what took him so long. Loin stared, utterly bewildered, demanding how Chris could possibly have gotten there so fast. Chris simply replied that there wasn't much to it. Loin insisted it was impossible, spluttering that Chris's path should have had much stronger monsters. A slow smile spread across Chris's face as realization dawned. So Loin was behind the rig path. Chris chuckled, remarking he'd thought the monsters seemed a bit underwhelming for their supposed level. Loin bristled at the blatant mockery, demanding who Chris thought he was talking to. Chris casually flicked a card between his fingers, asking if formalities were necessary when it was just the two of them. Enraged, Loin declared Chris an arrogant asshole. He acknowledged that fighting was taboo during the rite, but roared that he would crush Chris here and now anyway. Loin lunged, dark energy swirling around his fist, unleashing a magic combat art, a technique designed to explode magic power at close range or disable opponents by snapping joints. Chris sidestepped the blow with ease. Loin cursed the slippery rat as he gathered power for another strike, vowing to break him. Chris merely called him a dummy and effortlessly caught Loin's incoming wrist. Loin looked shocked for a split second before Chris twisted, advising his rival not to cry even if it hurt. Loin's face contorted in agony as a sickening crunch echoed, followed by his scream. Just then, Aloys arrived, panting heavily from exertion. He gasped, seeing Loin unconscious on the floor, and demanded if Chris had done this. Chris simply called him a slowpoke and asked if Aloys would faint on his own, or if Chris needed to beat him until he did. Aloys, refusing to back down, declared he hadn't been idle and gathered his own magic, challenging Chris to come at him. Chris sighed, noting the deja vu, and promptly knocked Aloys unconscious beside Loin, figuring someone would eventually collect them. Chris paused, his thoughts turning serious. 5 years from now, the first great war against the Alliance would break out. Before then, he absolutely needed to have the Dark Magic clan firmly within his grasp, which was precisely why he mused he couldn't afford to share even an ounce of the sacred darkness with these fools. Having finished his cleaning up, Chris turned towards the great doors, now pulsing with power. It was time to take possession of the sacred darkness. Chris stood before the great doors, reaching out towards the pulsating energy crackling between them, the sacred darkness. This was the power that offered a fiend the chance to become a true, transcendent being. He knew the legends. The current Elder Clan head had absorbed 80% of this power, making him one of the strongest beings alive, rivaling even demon monarchs. The clan's progenitor, the Dark Destroyer, became a demon king after absorbing over 90%. Chris clenched his fists, determination hardening his gaze. If he could somehow absorb 100% of the pure dark energy. He stepped forward into the chamber where the raw power coalesced into a swirling, dark orb. He could potentially surpass even the mightiest demon emperor. Reaching out, he began the perilous process of drawing the immense energy into himself. Meanwhile, back in the main family's audience chamber, the elders received the final report from the rite. Disbelief filled the room. Every participant other than Christian Khazar had been eliminated. Young Master Loin was reported to be in serious condition. Speculation arose immediately. Perhaps Christian used some trick, a banned magic tool, even. One agitated elder demanded a thorough investigation and punishment. But Jupian, the second young lady, cut them off, declaring an investigation unnecessary. She stated confidently that the bastard Christian wouldn't be able to enter the sacred ground anyway. The fact he hadn't emerged for 2 whole days, she reasoned, could only mean one thing. Unless the sheer quantity required this much absorption time, he had already been crushed by the overwhelming power of the sacred darkness and died. She recalled that even the formidable Elder Clan head had reached a limit to how much he could absorb. That bastard was undoubtedly dead, likely without even a corpse remaining. She stood silently for a moment, resolute. Even if, against all odds, he came back alive, she vowed darkly she would kill him herself. Jupian reflected bitterly on her past. After her father died fighting the Alliance, she and Loin were adopted by their uncle, Viscount Langham. Her footing within the clan was already unstable, and with Loin now failing to receive the sacred darkness, his support would vanish. No one would back him as successor now. This setback for Loin solidified her own position. Christian would pay for this indignity. Elsewhere, servants gossiped, asking if that good-for-nothing was out yet. One sneered that he must already be dead, calling it punishment for his greedy ambition. Another pointed towards Marie, who waited patiently by a window, commenting that the ghost would soon meet her master's ghost. Marie's ethereal form flickered. Though her heart fluttered waiting for her young master, she turned to the servants, her usual playful demeanor replaced by chilling intensity. She warned them that if they kept being noisy, she'd turn them into ghosts under her control, perhaps assigning them to scrub spectral floors for eternity. Got it. The servants shrieked in terror and fled. Marie turned back to the window, silently urging her master to return quickly, thinking that making a maiden wait was not cool at all. Floating in a void of pure, overwhelming darkness, Chris struggled. An unending pressure choked the breath from his throat. He estimated he was only around the 70% absorption mark, finding it far more difficult than anticipated. Yet he couldn't stop. He steeled his resolve, knowing the real test began near 90%. If he took in too much, exceeding his limit, his core would shatter, and he would die here before the future war even began. He needed more capacity. That was it. He focused his mind, recalling a technique, Dragonheart. Dragons possessed the largest natural container for their cores. If he could imitate that structure, even for a few minutes, he channeled his energy, reshaping his core, forcing it to expand. Pain lanced through him as cracks appeared. He grit his teeth, knowing this was his limit. Just as despair threatened, a swirling vortex of blue and gold energy appeared, coalescing into a familiar, luminous figure, Mefina. Chris stared, shocked, wondering how a demon could enter this sacred space. Mefina explained serenely that the power of demons allowed communication with darkness, making entry no difficulty for her. It was therefore possible, she stated, for her to help him in this instance, offering her aid without any conditions. Chris wary asked why. Mefina simply smiled, calling it a fleeting whim. She extended her glowing hand, inviting him to take it and absorb all of the remaining sacred darkness. 1 week later, the elder clan head sat enjoying tea with Marion in a sunlit garden, Simon standing nearby. Marion commented that with no news even now, she would be hard-pressed to say Christian was still alive. She couldn't fathom such reckless greed. Simon interjected smoothly, adding that Viscount Langham, the acting head, agreed and wished to close the pathway leading to the sacred ground soon. He politely asked the elder if he would give the command. The elder scowled slightly, muttering about the wicked brat testing him. He turned to Simon, asking the blood drinker if he truly thought the reckless child was still alive. Simon admitted the odds were close to zero, but added with a grin, wasn't he quite the interesting young master? The elder considered this, lost in thought. Finally, he gave his decision. Tell Langham to keep the path open for one more day. Marion bowed silently and departed, leaving the elder alone with his thoughts and Simon's unsettling smile amidst the peaceful scenery.